I was born into a scenario that I'm sure you've heard before. A careless dad knocks up his wife and blames her for it, and in the process, also ends up blaming the kid for existing in the first place. That's the scenario that I was born into. Benny, if you don't mind. My dad wasn't the best person to be sober around, much less drunk, and my mom was more than ready to make excuses for him. He was doing this because I deserved it, or only did these things to me because he loved me. One night, Dad came home exceptionally angry and drunk. He'd just been fired from another one of his short-term jobs and was drowning his sorrows away in the only way he knew how, with cheap beer and taking his anger out on me. At this point, I was 12 years old and a wreck from constant verbal and physical abuse from my dad. I hardly said a word to anyone for fear of some sort of retaliation that my dad would be sure to give me for daring to speak out of line. So I figured, why bother to speak at all? Well, that wasn't a very good solution either, since not answering my dad would lead to a beating as well. A lose-lose scenario. After I had gotten a good thrashing from my dad and was left a crying mess on the floor, bruised and shivering, my mom quickly came over and pulled me into her embrace. She patted my head and rocked me back and forth in an attempt to stop me from crying, though I don't think she was trying to comfort me. She was just trying to shut up my cry so I wouldn't further upset him. "He's just been having such a hard time holding down a job," she told me, patting the side of my cheek that wasn't bruised from my dad's slaps. "You have to understand, Benny, he does all of this for us," she told me. I looked up at her and saw her fake smile, the one she put on to try and reassure me, and herself. At that moment, in a fit of fear, anger, and disgust, I shoved my mom away and ran to the door. She called out to me, and I could hear my dad barking at me, but I didn't even bother to turn around. I sprinted as fast as possible into the woods surrounding our home. Without so much as a glance back, I ran into the thick branches and bushes of the woods and just kept running until I felt like my lungs would pop from exertion. Falling to the floor against a dead tree, I curled up into a ball and began to cry silently to myself. This wasn't a planned thing. It was the middle of autumn, and I hadn't thought to bring a jacket or hoodie. In the distance, I could hear my dad and mom shouting for me, but their voices were far away and almost like echoes from a canyon. So I simply stood up and kept walking, hugging myself as I tried to keep warm, and carried on deeper into the woods, sniffling and crying all the way. I must have wandered for an hour or so. The sounds of my parents were long gone by then. I was sitting next to the creek that cut through the forest and passed the time by tossing pebbles into it, watching the ripples that were created and the occasional small fish that swam by to inspect. Curled up in a ball, I thought about what I could do next. Go back home and endure these beatings until the day my dad finally snapped and killed me? And tell the police and end up in foster care? None of these were good options. So I was just stuck there next to the creek. My endless thinking was interrupted by the snapping of branches on the other side of the creek. Looking up quickly and reaching for a nearby stick to protect myself, I was confused to see the silhouette of a dog staring back at me. At first, I thought it was the shadow of a dog, but then I realized the dog itself was completely pitch black. It stared back at me with bright red eyes. It was like every cartoon scenario had come true in my head, and I was completely taken aback by it. It didn't make any other moves for a bit before it suddenly started walking down the creek. I watched it for a moment as it started walking slowly down the direction in which the creek flowed. I kept watching before standing up and following it. Something deep within me was telling me to follow it. It wasn't a command like my dad would give me. It was more like a suggestion, one that I decided to follow. We both walked parallel to each other down the creek for a while, each of us aware of the other but not acknowledging each other. As the sun began to set, we came across a fallen tree that acted as a bridge to access either side of the creek. We stopped, and each looked over at the other. Each of us wondered who would cross. I looked back behind me toward the direction where my house was. It only took me a few seconds to decide to cross the fallen tree and follow this strange dog. Having crossed the log without much issue, I carefully lowered my hand to the dog so he could sniff me, but he didn't bother. He simply turned around and started walking towards the tree line behind him. And taking a deep breath, I followed after him, fully intending on seeing where this would take me. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the wind began to pick up, I shivered as my lack of clothing began to catch up with me. But the dog continued on his way, and I had no other option but to follow him and hope that we would arrive at our destination soon. As the sun had nearly completely set, we suddenly came upon a clearing, and to my absolute shock and wonderment, there in this clearing in the middle of the woods was a giant circus tent. The lights were bright and shining, and most importantly for me at that moment, warm. Before I could process the fact that a whole circus had somehow spawned in the middle of the woods, the dog suddenly took off running towards the tent, letting out a strange bark as it did so. It soon disappeared into the tent, and I was left with a new dilemma: freeze out here, or risk being taken back to my parents and enter the warm-looking tent. Warmth won out in the end. Taking careful steps, I dared to enter and was immediately vindicated in my decision as I was greeted by warmth in the bright lights and colors of the massive tent. It was laid out like a normal circus, with a bunch of seats surrounding an arena. I was amazed, having only ever seen a circus on TV. It was like a dream come true to see one in person. I was about to take my seat when I noticed the dog quickly running across the seats and towards the other side of the tent. Getting up quickly, I followed after him. I just wanted to get warm and hopefully stay in the tent until the sun came up. The dog quickly ducked through another doorway and disappeared down a corridor that connected to another tent that connected to the main big top. I followed him as best I could, wondering where all the workers were. I didn't have to wonder long. I soon was met with the ringmaster. He had his back to me and was looking down at the dog. The dog sat on the floor looking up at the ringmaster. He then looked over to me and licked his nose. The ringmaster spun on his heels to face me, and I was met with the most confusing assortment of colors I'd ever been exposed to. His hair was long and white, but with black tips at the bottom in various places. He had piercings all across his ears and one in his nose. His eyes were like an explosion of color, green and yellows mixed in an almost hypnotic spiral. A large scar cut diagonally across his entire face, and several other smaller ones dotted the visible parts of his skin. And his uniform was some of the prettiest colors I'd ever seen anyone wear before. "Well, hello!" he suddenly shouted excitedly, stepping closer to me. I instinctively backed up, afraid that any large adult no doubt meant some sort of harm to me, but he held up both his hands to show that he didn't mean to harm me. "What brings you out here?" he asked with a smile. He had a hoarse voice with a slight hint of an Italian accent. I stammered, and realized it had been so long since I'd ever actually talked to someone. It took me a moment to figure out how words worked and functioned in my head. You, the man asked. The smile still plastered on his face as he stared at me, waiting for an answer. I looked over at the dog and realized that it had disappeared. "I ran away from home, and a dog led me here." That was certainly a condensed version of what had happened, but if the man felt any sorrow for me, he certainly didn't let that show on his face, because if anything, he looked thrilled. "Why, great! That's incredible!" he told me, giggling and cackling to himself. "You can join my Freakshow," he told me, the happiness on his face apparent. I stared at him, dumbfounded. Shouldn't he have called the police or tried to get more information out of me? Freakshow? I thought this was a circus. I said, looking around at the tent that surrounded us. He looked at me and gave me a shrug and a hoarse snicker. I guess it does kinda look like one, but I can assure you, my freak show is way better than a lousy circus, he told me with excitement. It was almost infectious how happy and excited he was by just me being there. Why do you want me to join? I'm not a freak, I told him, getting a loud howl of laughter from the strange ringmaster as he held his stomach and bent over from his laughing. It was almost a little scary just how much he seemed to be enjoying this. Oh, come on. We all have a freaky side, kid, he told me with a wink. Come on, I'm sure you'll be much happier here than at home with your parents. I mean, there's a reason why you ran away, isn't there? There always is, he said with another loud cackle. I swallowed a lump that had formed in my throat. How had this stranger known the reason I had run away? It freaked me out to no end, and I hugged myself tightly. He had a point, but this was a stranger with a circus or freak show in the middle of the woods, offering me a job and a place to live in. Even at 12 years old, I could smell that something was amiss. I don't know, I told him, taking a few steps back. His smile dipped ever so slightly, and something about that made me feel even more unsafe. The loud croaking of a raven broke the tension between us. One fluttered from the ceiling above us and came flapping down, landing right on my shoulder and croaking at the ringmaster. Ah, really? He told it, looking over at me with a new sense of understanding. This could be your new home, you know, he told me, getting down on his knees so we could meet eye to eye with each other. I know how hard it can be with a deadbeat father, but here we can take much better care of you than anywhere else in the world, he told me, putting his hand on my shoulder and offering me a more caring smile. Looking at the raven that had landed on my shoulder, I was surprised to see the same red eyes that the dog possessed. It leaned against my head and fluffed its feathers up ever so slightly. I looked back at the ringmaster, who again offered me a smile. Can I meet the performers first? I asked him, worried that they were some kind of gruesome, horrible creatures. And if that was going to be the case, it was going to be a choice between strange new monsters here or the same horrible monster I knew back home. The ringmaster's eyes lit up even brighter, and he quickly shot up to his feet in excitement. Oh, of course. Unfortunately, only a couple of them are here at the moment. The others are still in Europe, I'm afraid. We don't normally come to the U.S., so getting everyone here is always a headache, he said with another snicker before turning around to start leading me down the hall. I'm Benny, by the way, I told him as I followed after him. That stopped him in his tracks as he looked down at me. I stopped next to him and looked up at him. I barely reached his stomach with my height, and it was a pain to look up. Oh, where are my manners? He shouted, slapping his forehead and quickly taking the green striped top hat he was wearing off. Backing up a bit, he did a very dramatic bow with his hand outstretched to his side and his other one holding his hat to his chest. I am Antonio Garibaldi, and welcome to my freak show, Benny, my boy. But please, just call me Tony for now. That last sentence got a real big laugh out of him, and he patted me on the back and practically skipped down the hallway towards the other tent. Looking over at the raven on my shoulder, I offered it a small, nervous smile. I used my finger to give its head a small scratch as it followed after Tony. The raven made a few small croaks as I did so, which I took to mean that it was enjoying what I was doing. Tony lifted the tent's flap for me, and as I stepped into the warm light of the second tent, I was suddenly almost hit with a flying knife that came flying towards me and embedded itself in one of the wooden posts that held up the tent. Ah, hell, boss. A little warning would have been nice. If I had known you were bringing a stranger, I would have thrown a few more. A strong Russian accent greeted me after I had gotten done having a mini heart attack from what I was sure was a near-death experience. If I was scared of what had just happened to me, then seeing the person who had almost just killed me sent me a further shock. The person who had thrown the knife that had almost ended my life was a tall, heavily scarred man with messy black hair. His mouth had snake-bite piercings, and his mouth was contorted into a pissed-off scowl. My little 12-year-old eyes wandered down to the metallic left leg that he possessed. If it was a rude thing to do to him, then what would you have called him throwing a knife at me? Benny, my boy. Tony's chipper voice broke my disrespectful gaze, and I did my best to act like he didn't have a prosthetic leg at all. Meet Nikolai Dmitrievich, my lovely Russian knife thrower. Don't mind his attitude. It doesn't get any better the more you get to know him. Tony said with a chuckle as he grabbed the knife from the post and tossed it back over to Nikolai. He grabbed it without so much as a glance towards the object and returned the favor to Tony with a middle finger. Did you bring us a new friend? Excited giggling suddenly sprung out from behind us. Turning to the source of the giggling, I was shocked to see a clown strapped to a revolving wheel. The kind that a knife thrower uses for target practice. And sure enough, the clown's entire silhouette was outlined neatly with a row of knives. I sure have, Santiago. Nikolai, go ahead and untie him so he can meet our newest attraction, Tony said with excitement that seemed to surpass even the clown's own. Nikolai tissed in annoyance and walked over to the spinning wheel. I watched him walk on the metal prosthetic and was amazed to see that it didn't hamper his ability to walk at all. It was like it was and always had been his leg. Nikolai quickly pulled Santiago off the wheel and started pulling all his knives from it. Now, down from the wheel, Santiago eagerly walked towards me. As he did, I saw that his feet were constantly pointed toe-to-toe with each other, later learning, of course, that he had been born with a pigeon-toe walk. His clown outfit was frilly and fluffy, with a mixture of green and orange. His face wasn't completely painted, only his cheeks and nose, with a stripe of white going down over his eyes. Finally, reaching me with his awkward walk, he eagerly threw his arms around me and hugged me, surprising the raven and sending him fluttering off of my shoulder. What's your name? Where do you come from? Have you ever been to the circus? Are you joining us? What about your talent? What can you do? He was asking me a million questions at well over 1,000,000 miles a second. Each question was interrupted with a laugh or giggle. Soon he'd asked me so much that my head hurt trying to keep up with them all. What's your name? Where do you come from? And have you ever been to the circus? Are you joining us? What about your talent? What can you do? What's all this noise about? A soft voice asked all of us. I looked over Santiago as he continued to bombard me with questions and laughs, and watched as someone climbed down from the middle wooden post that held up a practice tightrope. I was surprised to see a rather chubby woman climbing down to join the chaos that was going on. She had dark tan skin like Santiago, but hers was broken up by splotchy patches of light skin, a condition I would eventually learn was called vitiligo. Abigail, just the perfect person to look over our new arrival, Tony said with a smile, as he shoved Santiago away with a push of his face and pushed me forward like I was a little lost puppy he had gotten her for Christmas. Her eyes positively lit up when she saw me, and she quickly came over to see me. "Hello, my child," she said in a tone that simply radiated the words motherly. My mom had a similar tone, but I could tell that she was forcing it. She was simply trying to keep herself and me together in any way she could. But coming from Abigail, it just seemed natural and correct. It was caring and inviting. "Are you going to be staying here with us?" she asked me with a soft and loving smile. Even with her clown makeup on, it still shone through just how caring she was. "Bringing in another street rat, boss?" a voice asked. I turned my gaze over to the source and let out a surprised and horrified gasp as I backed up into Abigail. Walking their way over toward the group that had assembled to greet me, I was completely terrified to see a two-headed person coming over towards us. "Aha! And last but certainly not least, the twins Edgar and Alan," Tony said with a smile and a nod as he came over to Abigail and me. "They truly are a sight to see, but I can assure you they mean you no harm. If anything, Alan probably thinks you'll be the one to hurt him." Tony and Santiago snickered together as they gave each other a high five. The left head looked over to the side to avoid my gaze, and I took it to mean that he was Alan. Both him and the other head, Edgar, possessed no pupils that I could see in their eyes. Edgar squinted his bright white eyes in annoyance and looked over to his brother. "Come on, say hello to him. He's gonna be staying here, so you're gonna have to get more used to him," he ordered his other head. Alan looked at him and then over to me and offered a half-hearted wave and a barely audible hello. "They're conjoined twins, and one of my favorite attractions here," Tony said with an excited glee, and he turned his attention over to me. "So, you've met some of my troupe. What do you think, Benny, my boy? Want to join my freak show?" he asked with a smile, his brightly colored eyes staring into my soul as he waited for an answer. I twiddled my hands as I stared at Tony and then at all the members gathered around me. Nikolai and Santiago were busy chatting with each other. Despite how scary he looked, Nikolai seemed perfectly content being around Santiago. The clown giggled and waved his oversized sleeves over his head as he spoke to Nikolai. Looking over at Abigail, she offered me another one of her caring smiles, and I returned one to her. I then looked over at the twins and did my best to get over the uncanny nature of them. What would I even do here?" I asked Tony. The fact that I didn't exactly have a talent I could use was a glaring issue. Tony grabbed his chin and let out a few "hmms" as he seemed to be trying to come up with something I could do. As if to answer him, the raven flew down to me and rested on my head. "Oh, how about animal tamer?" he said, as a smile crept up onto his face. I was a bit confused, mostly for the fact that I had never even owned a pet before, much less anything like a lion or tiger, but suddenly I felt the bird on my head become a lot heavier and felt something cold slither down onto my shoulder. Looking over, I was surprised to suddenly see a large black snake coiling around my neck. "It seems boss's little shadow friend has taken a liking to him," Nikolai said with an amused grin on his face. Santiago looking over and pointing at me with a great big smile on his face. I looked over at the snake, the same red eyes that the dog and raven possessed. So this thing had been those two. It was some sort of shapeshifter. "Wait, don't we already have an animal tamer?" Abigail asked. All eyes turned to Tony, and he gave a simple shrug. I'm sure I can talk to Ezekiel about this. He has been talking about wanting to leave after all, hasn't he? Tony asked his members. All of them looked away from him and awkwardly nodded. Now then, Benny, I'll ask you again. Would you like to join my freak show? He asked me, his eyes again staring into my soul. I looked over at the snake and gave it the same head scratch that I had given it when it had been a raven. This place, while certainly worthy of being called a freak show, was still more inviting to me than the prospect of returning home. When I ran away, I didn't have any sort of plan. I just ran as far as I could. And here was this opportunity to start a new life. Yes, I told Tony. His smile grew so wide I thought he was going to scream with excitement. He did the next best thing and threw his arms around me and gave me a giant hug. He passed me along to Abigail as she excitedly came up and wanted to hug me next. Even Santiago joined in and wrapped his giant oversized sleeves over me. And Nikolai and the twins couldn't care less about me though, which was fair. Tony showed me where I would be staying for the night, a bunk bed in one of the spare tent rooms he had in the living quarters tent. He promised me that he would soon have a proper room for me and a costume for me to wear. Abigail and Santiago came to my temporary room to wish me good night and to tell me just how excited they were to have me there. I couldn't sleep, though. Who could after suddenly deciding to run off and join a circus? I sat up in the dark room and held my new snake friend in my hands as he slithered around between my fingers. I smiled and watched as he changed sizes from a small little snake to a much bigger one. My mind went wild with the kinds of animals he could turn himself into. I thought that this place could be my new home and I could grow up to be an amazing performer. Sometime in the middle of the night, someone tried opening the tent flap across the room from mine and couldn't get it to open. I sat up in bed after another failed attempt to try and get some sleep and tried to tune my ears to try and see if I could hear anything else outside my room. Ezekiel, I was just looking for you. Tony's chipper voice suddenly rang out in the hallway. I stood up from my bed and tiptoed over to the door to get a clear listen. What's the matter, sir? Why is my tent locked? A stranger's voice asked Tony. This was probably the current animal tamer. Tony's chuckles were loud and easy to hear from where I was, and he was pretty close to my door. Well, it seems I found a replacement for you, Zeke. You've been saying how you've been wanting to leave the freak show for a while now, haven't you? He asked Ezekiel. There was a long pause where I couldn't hear anything from the two of them. What do you mean, sir? You know I love it here. Ezekiel was trying to reassure his boss that he indeed wanted to stay at the freak show. Aw, Zeke, you shouldn't lie to me. We both know you've been telling the other members how badly you want to get out of here. So why not just take an extended break from the show? I've already got a replacement lined up for you, Tony said, and I felt a chill run up my spine. I was the replacement. Please, sir, I just... Ezekiel was cut off before he could even say anything by Tony chuckling at him. But as his laugh continued, his already hoarse voice began to become more otherworldly, and I could hear some kind of cracking and snapping coming from the hall. Then, all of a sudden rush of noise, the sound of someone running away. Don't run, Zeke. You'll only tire yourself out. Tony cackled as his strange new voice seemed to chase after the running footsteps. In complete terror over what I had just heard, I ran back to my bed, dove headfirst into the blankets, and pulled them over my head. Still having that sense that if I covered myself completely in blankets, no outside force could harm me. The next day, I was awoken by Santiago jumping on my bed in excitement about the fact that breakfast was being served in the main tent. I told him thank you and watched as he slowly waddled his way out of my room and down the hall. As I stood up from bed and rubbed my eyes, trying to get the tired out of them, I bumped right into Tony as he waited for me at the door. "Great news, Benny! Looks like you'll be our new animal tamer," he said with a happy smile. I stared up at him and remembered everything that I had heard last night. That's great, sir, but what about Ezekiel?" I asked him, and he gave me a giggle and tousled my hair with his hand. "Oh, don't worry about him. I took care of him. Now, come on, we're a family here, and we eat all of our meals together," he told me. A smile on his face, and I couldn't help but notice that the scar across his face was leaking some blood. I nodded cautiously and followed him as he led me to the main tent. I've thought back to that night so many times, and I wish I had taken the chance and said no to Tony. Maybe all of the horrors would never have happened. Maybe I could have just left that night I heard him in the hallway and never gone back. But I didn't. I stayed. And that mistake will haunt me for the rest of my life. Eating breakfast with the troupe was a little awkward for me. I was so used to eating my meals in terrified silence, trying not to bring my dad's wrath down on me for the slightest reason. I had never had a meal where everyone seemed to really love each other. Abigail made sure I sat next to her while she handed me a plate stacked full of pancakes and syrup. Nikolai and Santiago sat across from me, too entertained with each other's company to notice me. The twins sat further along the giant table, more than content to be by themselves. Tony, meanwhile, sat at the head of the table and was one of the messiest eaters I'd ever seen in my life. "You'll have to excuse him, dear," Abigail told me, as she offered me a glass of milk from a pitcher. "Antonio doesn't have the best table manners, I'm afraid." I didn't want to be rude and stare at him, but it was hard not to see as he seemingly ate like an animal that was half-starved and half-crazy. "The best table manners? He has no table manners," Nikolai snorted, as we all turned to watch Garibaldi eat. Nikolai's comment sent Santiago into a fit of giggles, and soon the two of them were back to talking to each other. After having my fill, I sat awkwardly in my chair, not exactly sure what I was supposed to do now. I was now part of the Freakshow thanks to the little shapeshifter, but I still didn't feel like I belonged here. And the strange encounter I had overheard between Antonio and the former animal tamer still lingered in the back of my mind. The shapeshifter was in a raven form again today, and he perched on my shoulder like a parrot. I'd offered him some pancakes, but he didn't seem too interested in it. So the two of us just sat there silently at the table, while everyone around us chatted and talked to each other. "Oh, Benny, I've got an amazing surprise for you." Tony suddenly broke my awkward quietness and pulled everyone's attention over to him. Despite having eaten like a wild animal, his face was surprisingly free of stains. He stood up excitedly from his chair and hurried over to me. "Come along, I want to show it to you." He offered me his hand, and with a slight bit of hesitation, I took it and allowed him to lead me to this mysterious surprise he had for me. He led me to the troupe tent where everyone had their rooms. I was expecting him to have given me the same spare room I'd slept in the night before, but was surprised when he led me to a different room and opened the door for me. Stepping inside, I was floored to see that it was an almost exact copy of my room at home. But unlike my room at home, which was sparsely decorated and simplistic, this room was filled with toys that I'd never owned, an entire bookshelf that wasn't in my old room before, and a desk filled with several different kinds of art supplies. "This is amazing," I said with so much excitement that my voice gave out a little squeak, and running into the room to get a good look at everything. And Tony smiled as he leaned against the door frame, and watched as I inspected the whole room. The raven flapped off my shoulder and landed on my new art desk, also content to watch me run around and point at every new little thing that was here for me now. This is my room? I asked him, as I grabbed a teddy bear from my bed and gave it a hard squeeze. Of course it is. I wanted you to feel welcome here in your new home, and between shows you'll have quite a bit of downtime, so I figured I might as well get you some things to keep you entertained. He entered my room, his hands behind his back as he approached me. I looked up into his colorful eyes, again feeling like I was being sucked into them. Thank you, sir. This is everything I've ever wanted, I told him with a smile, and he smiled back at me. I looked over at the raven and saw him picking at the desk with his beak. I turned my head up to look at the beautiful lights I hung up from the ceiling and was more than happy to see that they flickered between different colors. I have one last thing for you, he told me, pulling his hands from behind his back and revealing a costume, short orange suspenders and a frilly green shirt. I looked at it and then up at him. He smiled a big toothy grin and practically shoved it on to me. Well, go ahead and try it. He stood up and turned around to leave, quickly shutting the door behind him. I looked down at the combination of clothes and figured that if I was part of the Freakshow, then I'd have to look the part. Shedding my clothes, I started putting the new ones on and to my surprise, found that they fit me perfectly. I walked over to the door and opened it up to show Garibaldi that the uniform fit. Aw, you look stupendous. You'll knock it out of the park with tonight's performance, he said with excitement, which got a jaw-dropping reaction from me. Tonight? But I haven't done anything like this before. Don't I need practice or something? I said in a panic, suddenly realizing that I had to perform in front of people. Garibaldi snickered and kneeled so he was on my level. Oh, don't worry, Benny. He'll be doing most of the work. He motioned over to the shapeshifter. All you have to do is name an animal, and he'll transform into it for you. No matter what it is, he can turn into it. For now, practice in here with him. I'll come by later and let you practice in the big top before the show. He said all of this with a smile and a tussle of my hair before standing up and giving my room one last look over. I wordlessly nodded as he turned to leave my room. My mind was zooming over 1,000,000 miles an hour as I tried to mentally plan out in my head how I was supposed to do all of this. I must have been standing there for a long while because I soon received a knock on my door. And getting pulled out of my panicked zoning, I opened my room door to see Santiago and Abigail standing out in the hall. Hello, dear. We decided to come check on you and see how you're holding up, Abigail said to me with a smile. Santiago, meanwhile, pushed past me and pigeon-toed his way into my room to get a good look at everything with wide-eyed excitement. Aw, you've got an amazing room, Benny, Santiago said with excitement, picking up some of the stuffed animals and tossing them in the air. I looked over at him and couldn't help but smile at his carefree nature. They were the best people who could have shown up here to cheer me up. Before they left, Santiago offered to help me put on the makeup I'd have to wear for my performance. I was hesitant at first, but when he said please over and over for almost a minute, I caved and let him do it. He did only some red cheeks and a red nose for me, while Abigail finished it off with a few colorful dots on my face. The two of them showed themselves out, and I was left in my new room with my shadowy shapeshifter. I sat at my desk and looked at him as he hopped around on my desk and pecked at it without a care in the world. I'd seen his different forms for myself, the dog that led me here, the snake, and the raven. Can you turn into a turtle, please? I asked him, not wanting to be rude and just order him around. He looked at me for a moment before his form melted into a puddle on my desk, scaring me for a brief second before he reformed into the shape of a turtle. I stared at him in amazement before carefully picking him up and examining him. He pulled his head into his shell when I brought him up to my face, and I couldn't help but smile in excitement at all the possibilities I could come up with. However, my moment of thinking was interrupted by the loud blaring of a train whistle. This caught me completely off guard, and I accidentally dropped my turtle friend from the fear and startling that I had just gone through. Realizing what I'd just done, I quickly dropped to the floor and picked him up. Are you okay?" I asked him with concern before he poked his head at me and gave me a little nod. I let out a sigh of relief before settling him on the table and quickly heading to the door to go out and see what that noise was. Before I got out into the hallway, I was greeted by a pair of boots waiting for me at the door. They were knee-high and had yellow smiley faces as the buckles. They also had a note attached to them. I picked the note up and quickly read it. "Boots make the man. Love, Tony." Looking down at my sneakers, I figured that they didn't fit my outfit. So I walked back into my room and kicked them off, pulling the boots on and making sure that I fit in them. It was only at this moment that I started to question how it was that Antonio knew my measurements and shoe size, and how he knew what my room looked like. That line of questioning was blown away once again once I heard the loud blaring of a train whistle. I quickly pulled my boots on and had the shapeshifter turn back into a raven so he could follow me toward the source of the train. We didn't have far to run, as when we exited the troupe tent, I was shocked to discover that an entire steam train had somehow appeared in the middle of the woods. It was a truly confusing thing for me to understand. We were in the middle of the woods with no train tracks anywhere to be seen. Garibaldi had said that his Freakshow usually traveled across Europe. How was this train here now? Before my brain completely turned to mush trying to figure it out, Santiago came tiptoeing over to me with excitement. He threw his giant sleeves around me and excitedly pointed at the train. Benny, there's someone I want you to meet." He pulled me toward the train, and I was amazed by the colors that the train possessed. Along with that, it also had several flags attached to each car and stars painted all across it. Santiago eagerly hobbled us over to one of the carts and knocked on the side entrance. Waiting a moment, the door slowly slid open, and a black woman stepped out. "Santiago, with feet like pigeons you come here with a boy who walks along with a shadow not his own?" She greeted us with a thick African accent. She wore a short orange halter top that wrapped around her body, a navy blue skirt with a celestial pattern, a green striped scarf around her waist with coins along the rim, and an orange bandana on her forehead. But the thing that pulled my attention to her was her bandaged face. It covered her left eye and left only the right one able to see anything. "Hi, Zara." Santiago happily waved his oversized sleeve at her and quickly pushed me over to her. "Well, this is Benny. He's joining the group." I awkwardly rubbed my arm and tried my best to make it look like I wasn't only focused on the fact that she only had one eye. "Benny, an unfamiliar child with a familiar story." I looked over at Santiago with confusion, but he just smiled at me and waved. "She always talks like that," he told me with a giggle, before quickly tiptoeing away when he heard Nikolai shouting for him. "Time to go practice. Have fun, Benny," he said, as he quickly waddled away. I looked back over at Zara and saw that she was taking her time to examine me. "Offer your hand to me, child, and I will see what you cannot." She offered her hand to me, and with great hesitation, I offered her mine. She flipped my hand over so my palm was up. Within moments of doing so, I could tell that something had caught her off guard with her reaction to it. What's the matter?" I asked her, as she carefully placed her finger on my palm and began tracing it across the lines that crisscrossed across my hand. Strange. Your future is clear and yet so unclear. It's set in stone, yet the stone itself may change around it. Yours is a palm which I have never encountered before, she told me, clearly fascinated with the oddity that she had just discovered. Suddenly, in her reading, she came to a dead stop at one point in my hand and quickly looked up at me. The mantis awaits in the giant flower that you live in, she told me, as she dropped my hand and looked down at me. What? I asked her in confusion, not having understood anything she had told me at all. And besides the vague idea of my future being unclear and clear, but judging by her reaction, something rubbed me the wrong way about all of this. She kept her gaze on me before swallowing a lump in her throat and offering me a small smile. You shouldn't worry. What I have seen may not truly happen, but you must be careful, for danger lurks within smiling faces, Benny, she said to me, before bowing slightly and returning to her train car, having left me completely confused and just a bit nervous. I started walking away from the seemingly magic train and back towards the tent. Mein Gott, don't tell me Tony brought another street rat to the circus. A slightly German-accented voice stopped me in my tracks. Turning around back to the train, I watched as an orange-haired woman stepped off from the train, a look of complete disgust on her face as she looked at me. Following her as she descended the train car was a tan-skinned man about a whole foot taller than the woman. Ah, no, that means he's gonna have that fake friendly stick, isn't it? He sighed as he hopped right down to the floor from the train car and rolled himself into a ball as he landed and rolled right over to me, looking down at me with a sense that he was far superior to me. What do you mean? Mr. Garibaldi has been nice to me since I got here, I told him, as I stared into his judgmental green eyes. He had long brown hair that was tied up in a ponytail and still managed to reach down to his shoulders. Soon the woman came walking over to join him, and she crossed her arms at me, responding to my statement with an angry tisk. Look, kid, you shouldn't even bother being here. Go run off back to whatever sewer pipe Tony drowned you out of, because joining this circus is going to be the biggest mistake of your life, she tissed angrily, almost getting me to start crying on the spot with her mean comments. Yeesh, Eva, the man said, as he looked over at the woman, who I guess was named Eva. You didn't have to go that far. He looks like he's about to start crying. I quickly tried to wipe the few tears from my face to hide the fact that I was already crying. Why should I bother pretending to be nice to him just because he's new? He probably won't even last a week here. Now, come on, Jasper. We need to practice so I don't drop you face first into the ground. She walked right past me, bumping into me and sending me staggering backward and my raven fluttering a bit as he caught his footing on my shoulder. As if you're the reason people come to see us? I'm the one with the moneymaker after all. Jasper scoffed as he followed after Eva. The two of them seemed to argue the whole way as they walked toward the tent. Left alone with their harsh words and with Zara's predictions fresh in my mind, I began again to have second thoughts about having joined the Freakshow in the first place. My self-doubt was interrupted by my raven as he pecked at my hair and tugged on it, pulling me out of the labyrinth of my mind and towards the big top tent. I figured he wanted me to practice with him, so I followed his lead as he flapped off my shoulder and started to fly towards the tent. I followed after him and wiped the last few tears and snot from my face. I was determined to show those two jerks that I did indeed belong here. I was amazed by everyone's performances. Getting to practice with them was like seeing a private show all by myself, with the added fact that I also had to participate in it. I was able to learn everyone's acts and how they worked. Nikolai and Santiago worked together like I had seen them do when I first entered the Freakshow. Nikolai was a skilled knife thrower, and Santiago was his target. The clown would occasionally tell jokes, but it was at his own risk, as his jokes often caused Nikolai to begin laughing and mess up his aim. Abigail, despite her larger frame, was the tightrope walker. It hadn't clicked for me when we first met that she had been practicing her tightrope walking. No doubt she had done it plenty of times, but she still had an aura of nervousness while doing it. Jasper and Eva were the acrobats. I watched as the two of them swung from the ceiling like monkeys, doing amazing flips and twirls. The two of them even jumped off their respective swings, caught each other in their arms, and fell to a much lower swing. During their practice, I could still hear them arguing with each other, with Eva threatening to drop Jasper on more than one occasion. I learned that the twins and Zara had separate tents set up outside for their respective acts. It made sense since the twins were a spectacle without ever having to do much, but the two of them could juggle and do separate things from one another. It wasn't every day that you could find conjoined twins like the two of them, so it was easy to say they had the easiest job. And since Zara was a fortune teller, it made sense to set her up with a tent as well. I was so enamored with everyone's practice that I didn't really even do my own very well. And the shapeshifter got me to pay attention every once in a while, but by the time Garibaldi came in with news that the show would begin in 2 hours, I had completely wasted my opportunity to practice. Garibaldi called us over for a group meeting. Now, as you all know, Benny is new to the Freakshow. He pointed to me and I gave everyone an awkward wave. That being said, I figured we'd end tonight with his first performance, he said with an excited wave and quick happy claps. Everyone muttered amongst themselves and looked down at me as I stared down at the floor in horror. I wished I had practiced more than I had. It's okay, sweetheart. Abigail's soothing voice comforted me. She wrapped her arms around me from behind and gave me a soft, warm hug. Santiago quickly waddled over and tousled my hair, a big smile plastered on his face. I was grateful for their support, but looking over at Jasper and Eva, I was met with their icy cold glares. Swallowing a lump in my throat, I followed everyone back towards the hall that led to our rooms. I sat on my bed, nervously picking at the skin on my fingertips as I could hear the sounds of people arriving at the Freakshow. The last 2 hours flew by in a blur until at last Garibaldi came to gather me from my room. Don't dwell on it too much, Benny, my boy. I'm sure you'll do amazing, he said with a hoarse laugh, placing his hat on top of his head and heading out to greet the audience. I followed after him and poked my head out from behind the tent flap and was met with the entire big top filled to the brim with people. My fear suddenly amped up to 11. Ladies and gentlemen, Garibaldi shouted, his voice reverberating through the big top and getting everyone gathered to watch the show to quiet down. Thank you all so much for coming to my amazing freak show, he said with a hint of overwhelming pride. Tonight you will see things that amaze you, frighten you, and maybe even inspire you. Now give it up for the duo that we love to laugh at, Nikolai and Santiago. The crowds cheered and clapped as stereotypical carnival music began to blare. I watched from behind the tent flap as Santiago was tied to a spinning wheel, and Nikolai delighted in throwing knife after knife at him, sometimes with his eyes closed, with his back turned to Santiago. And for the finale, after Santiago had said probably every joke he'd ever thought up, Nikolai pulled an enormous Bowie knife from his metal prosthetic leg and tossed it right at Santiago's head. The knife missed the clown's scalp by mere inches and impaled his hat to the wheel. The crowd roared with approval as Nikolai turned to bow at all of them, and Santiago waved excitedly from his position strapped to the wheel. The lights soon went out for a brief moment, and Garibaldi appeared back in his position in the middle of the tent. A delightful show, but now you'll see that sometimes to reach for the stars, you simply have to swing for it, he said with a smile as he pointed up towards the ceiling of the tent. The lights dimmed down and spotlights shone out to the sky. Abigail was there already in the middle of the tightrope. She was holding an umbrella in one hand and a mini table in her other hand. I could tell from down here how nervous she was. Suddenly, Jasper came swooping down from a swing and placed a vase full of water and flowers on Abigail's mini table. He let go of his swing and somersaulted through the air. Eva next swooped in, hanging onto the swing by her legs, and caught Jasper just as he was beginning to fall toward the ground. Abigail was in her own little world, doing her best to just stay focused and complete her part of the set. The acrobats circled Abigail as she continued to make her way over to the other side. All the while, Jasper and Eva continued to add more things onto the mini table. By the time Abigail reached the other side of the tightrope, the table had a vase, several plates, and a toaster on top of it. The crowd was eating it up, but I was panicking when I realized that my turn was fast approaching. "It's your turn, Benny," Tony said, as he wrapped an arm around me from behind and succeeded in scaring a scream from me. "Don't worry too much. Like I said, he'll be doing most of the work," he told me with a smile and a chuckle. He walked past me, and I followed after him. Finally, I emerged from behind the tent flap, and as I did so, I noticed that the music that was filling the tent had a source. Hidden off to the side was a giant wagon, and inside the wagon was a giant pile of flesh and faces. My heart stopped, and I let out a muffled scream as Tony quickly caught me from behind and covered my mouth. "Oh, I almost forgot. Don't mind bandwagon. They may look scary, but they're harmless. They enjoy playing music more than anything." Tony said it so nonchalantly that under any other circumstance I would have easily believed him. But as he walked off, I couldn't tear my gaze away from the creature. It writhed and jiggled in its wagon. Stray hands played the accordion, some were playing the keyboard, and one of the heads blew into a harmonica, and one was blowing into a trumpet with the help of a stray hand. And for the finale of tonight, the newest addition to the Freakshow, our brand new animal tamer, Benny, Garibaldi shouted out. I was so scared by the horrible creature playing music that I almost didn't hear my name being called. Before the situation got too awkward, my shapeshifter friend tapped me on the head with its beak to get my attention. Walking out into the spotlight, I received a few scattered claps. I could tell most people were probably looking forward to something much more interesting than a random 12-year-old with a red-eyed raven sitting on his head. The silence was almost enough to make me start crying again. I could feel a panic setting in as I felt my breathing becoming harder and harder to do. But before I could have a meltdown on the circus floor, the raven fluttered off my head and suddenly shifted and morphed into a giant dog. That got people's attention. The dog looked back at me with the same deep red eyes it had always possessed and flicked its head. It was motioning for me to give it a command. Taking a few deep breaths to regain my composure, I took a few cautious steps toward the giant dog and carefully placed my hand on its muzzle. "Please, turn into a lion?" I asked him. He looked at me and nodded, backing up and letting out a roar as a full black mane sprouted around its head. The crowd was caught off guard and shocked by the display. I smiled a little and muttered a soft thank you to him. "Can you turn into a unicorn?" I asked him, thinking of the first mythical creature that popped into my head. He lowered his head for a moment before his body slimmed down and began to grow taller. Soon he'd taken the form of a slender horse, and a horn grew on his head. This stunt got everyone's attention, and they were shouting and cheering for me. It was the first time in my life that I felt that I had done anything special. I carefully approached him and held his long face in my hands. "Can I ride you?" I asked him. He seemed to think about this for a moment, before getting down low enough for me to clamber onto his back. Once I was safely on, he began to trot around the circle to the sound of uproarious applause and cheers for the both of us. When my part of the show was over, we all gathered in the middle and got a huge round of applause. Everyone from the Freakshow crowded around me after we had all taken a bow, and the Freakshow was deemed to be over. Santiago and Abigail were the most upfront with how happy and excited they were with my performance. "I would have done it better, but I guess for your first time it was all right." Nikolai shrugged, as he played around with his butterfly knife. It was the first sort of compliment I'd gotten from him, so it made me feel a lot better about staying with the Freakshow. With the show over, we were allowed by Garibaldi to return to our tents with a job well done. I was on the way to my room when I heard a few voices coming from outside. Thinking that it was a few members of the troupe, I skipped going to my room and headed outside into the dark to see if I could see the source of the voices. Following the trail, I was greeted by a group of drunk guys teasing the twins. "This is the kind of freak show I signed up for," one of them laughed as they tossed an empty beer can at the twins. Alan cowered away from them as they heckled and laughed at him. Edgar, meanwhile, was stoic and didn't bother to show them any reaction. Before the drunks could do anything else to the twins, a familiar voice interrupted their heckling. "Gentlemen!" Garibaldi's overly excited voice startled not only the men, but me. "If it's something freaky you wish to see, you only have to follow me. I'll show you something truly freaky," he said with his characteristic snicker. The drunk men muttered to themselves for a moment before agreeing and following Garibaldi over to one of the side tents. Keeping to the shadows so as not to be seen, I followed after them. Garibaldi led them into the tent and closed the flap behind him. I reached the tent and was greeted by a giant funhouse. Lifting the tent flap, I discovered that it was pitch black inside. My curiosity was big, but my fear of total darkness was bigger, so I quickly closed the flap and started making my way back toward my room tent. As I was walking away, I started hearing screams coming from the funhouse, and I quickened my pace to get to my room. The next day, there wasn't a single sign of the drunks, and the freak show began to pack up and load everything onto the train. I watched with unease as Tony and Nikolai pulled a bandwagon onto the train, and its eerie dead faces stared at me. I was worried that some of those faces might have belonged to those drunk men. After my first performance, and after the drunks disappeared into the funhouse, I was a little more apprehensive about continuing to be in the freak show. Seeing Nikolai and Antonio pull the bandwagon onto the train freaked me out. But before I could process anything, I was interrupted by Santiago's excited giggling as he wrapped his arms around me and hugged me tightly. "You're gonna love Europe so much, Benny," he told me with that endless amount of happy charm he possessed. And it was like any worry I had instantly vanished whenever I saw his painted face and its contagious smile. How does this train even take us to Europe?" I asked him, as I turned to take in the giant multicolored locomotive. I was still at a loss over how it suddenly appeared in the forest with no track or noise, besides the whistle to announce its arrival. "I honestly don't know. We just sort of arrive at our destination after a while." Santiago shrugged at me. Clearly, he hadn't cared to have given it much thought. But before I could ask him any further questions, the two of us were called over by Abigail to help the rest of the troupe pack everything up. I did the best I could do with my 12-year-old strength. It was as I was loading my things from my room onto the train that I learned of our destination from Garibaldi. "France?" I asked him. He gave me an excited nod and quickly shoved a brochure into my hand, almost knocking the shapeshifter from my shoulder. The little guy in his panic turned into a snake and quickly coiled around my neck to keep himself from falling. It got a little surprise gag from me, but nothing further. "We just have to pick up the final members of our little family, and we can show you an amazing time, Betty," Garibaldi said with excitement, as he quickly rushed past me to help the twins load their items onto one of the storage cars. Garibaldi walked up to the engine car and looked like he was talking to someone. I assumed it was the conductor or the train engineer. I couldn't exactly see Garibaldi being allowed to ride a bicycle, much less a whole train. "Oh, God, did he say we're going to France?" Nikolai asked, as he sat down at a wooden crate next to me. I looked up at him and nodded, showing him the brochure that Garibaldi had given me. The look his scarred and burnt face gave me sent my gaze quickly back down to the ground to avoid it. I thought the boss had finally ditched that French freak and his stupid gremlins. He stabbed the brochure with one of his knives and chucked it as hard as he could against a nearby tree, pinning it there. "Do you not like him?" I asked the Russian. He looked down at me and then quickly looked around him. Once he was sure no one could overhear us, he crossed his arms and let out an annoyed sigh. "Word of advice, kid. Stay away from him. No one in the troupe likes him. Not even the boss likes him that much. So you're better off just avoiding him." With those simple words of advice, Nikolai walked off, muttering a bunch of words to himself in Russian. As I loaded the last of my things onto the train, I could tell that news of our destination had reached the rest of the members because their once cheery demeanors had all but evaporated. But despite that, we all together had taken down the circus tents and booths and finally loaded them all onto the train. When Garibaldi called for all aboard, I hesitated in climbing up the steps. There were still lingering doubts in my mind. The snake on my shoulder nudged me to go forward, but I still stood there, frozen with indecision. "Move, twep," Eva told me, as she shoved past me to board the train, followed quickly after by Jasper, who barely even glanced at me with his face held so high. The next person was a lot nicer since it was Abigail who offered me her hand. I looked at her and her patchy skin. Despite the fact I'd never seen someone with vitiligo before, I had already gotten to know her so well that it no longer even bothered me. "Come on, Benny, can't keep your new family waiting," she said with that loving smile she always had. I looked at my snake, who stared back at me with his deep red eyes. He offered me a little flick of the tongue which licked my nose and got a surprised giggle out of me. I took Abigail's hand and followed her on board the train. As it turned out, we had all had our own private cabin, so I was left with my shapeshifter in a bed along with a seat and even a bathroom. Carefully, I took the shapeshifter off my shoulder and placed him on the bed while I went to use the bathroom. I took the time to get the makeup off my face and also change out of my circus clothes. I didn't exactly know if this was allowed, but I was alone and wanted to be back in my normal clothes, at least for the meantime. With that all finished, I felt the train start moving as soon as I exited the bathroom. Wanting to see it move, I walked over to the window, only to find that it was completely tinted and that I was unable to see out of it. I then figured out why Santiago didn't know how the train moved. Plopping myself down on the bed, I decided that now was as good a time as ever to discover some more things I could do with my shapeshifter friend. I asked him to turn into various small things, from a beetle to a bunny, and he did this all with little effort on his part. This filled my mind with various ideas of what to ask him to turn into for our next performance. I quickly got some notebook paper and a pen from the art supplies that had been in my room and began to jot down ideas for him to turn into. As I did this, I received a knock at my door, And telling whoever it was to enter, I was surprised to see that it was Zara who had decided to come visit me suddenly. Her single eye scanned my room before landing down on me. It looked like she was hesitating whether to come in or not, so I nodded at her. "Pardon my intrusion upon your sanctuary. I bring you a charm to which it can be said will bring upon you some favor from the spirits," she told me, opening up her clenched right hand and revealing a small necklace. Trying to decode what she'd told me in my mind, I figured in some way that she was giving me a good luck charm. "Thank you," I told her, as I sat my pen down and walked over to her to take it from her. Before I could, she slowly took my hand, opened it palm side up, and let the necklace fall from hers into mine. It was a simple one made of string and beads with a shining emerald. "It's really pretty," I told her with a smile, slipping it over my head and letting it dangle down to my chest. She bowed her head down at me slightly and backed up a bit before it seemed like she had something else she wanted to tell me. "The stone matches your eyes. Now 3 eyes you shall have. Be safe, child, for the mantis will not hesitate to harm you when a chance to do so he has." She bowed again before wordlessly slipping out into the hall. I stood there, my brain working overtime to try and figure out what she was trying to tell me. I closed the door to my cabin and went back over to the bed. I sat down and stared down at the necklace, playing with the emerald stone as her warning played around in my head. This was the second time she'd mentioned the mantis. She'd mentioned it the first time she'd read my palm, and now again. Was it a warning about the final Freakshow member waiting for us in France? I played around with the thought in my head before a sudden squawking from my desk pulled me out of my deep thoughts. My shapeshifter friend was a parrot, the last thing I asked him to turn into, and he pecked at my incomplete list. Smiling back at him, I let the emerald drop back down to my chest and quickly hurried over to finish brainstorming ideas for my next act. Any thoughts of mantises were quickly forgotten in the excitement over my brainstorming session. Finding my legs growing restless, I picked up my shapeshifter friend and had him coil around my throat in a snake form. I exited my cabin and started walking in no particular direction down the train's halls. I was planning just to stretch my legs out for a moment, and there wasn't any better way of doing this than just walking. Soon I reached the door that led to the next cart, and without a second thought, I opened it and walked in. And I immediately regretted my decision when I came face to faces with Bandwagon. It was sitting there in the dimly lit cart with its instruments still in the places where it had had them during the performance. The mass of flesh and faces writhed a little at my intrusion of its privacy, but it didn't say anything. And I think that was scarier than if it had screamed or roared at me. Its dead silence with only the faint sounds of musical instruments terrified me, and I screamed as loudly as I could, quickly shutting the door and running full sprint back into my room. The only thing that kept me from having a panic attack was my shapeshifter friend turning into a puppy and licking my face. Giggling and calming down, I patted his head softly and thought that I would do everything I could to avoid Bandwagon. I had a few more visitors over as the train continued to chug along toward our destination. Santiago was next, as we both told jokes to each other, and he had fun watching my friend turn into whatever small animal the clown could think of. Abigail came to join us with food from the dining cart. Garibaldi's rule about eating together was usually not observed while traveling, so we were allowed to eat in our rooms. Nikolai was my final visitor, as he had grown bored in his room and decided to join me, mostly because Santiago refused to leave my room. I had expected our journey to take several days, if not weeks. I had always heard the horror stories of traveling across the country on a train. If we were somehow going to get to France, I figured it'd take us just as long, if not longer. But to my surprise, just as we were all finishing the food Abigail had brought for us, the train came to a sudden stop. "Oh, dear God, we're here," Nikolai sighed, as he sat his barely eaten burger down on his plate and leaned back in my bed. I looked at everyone else and saw that they had much of the same reaction. Even Abigail, who was friendly and loving to everyone I had met so far, had a look of apprehension on her face. "We're just lucky that Tony will set them up in their own car. We won't have a repeat of last time when they all had to share one room," Abigail said, still trying to remain positive, despite the fact that she was the only one who took any solace in that. "Them? I thought it was only one person," I asked. From what Nikolai had told me before he had departed, I thought that was the case. The three all looked at each other before turning back to me. It was obvious they didn't want to talk about whoever was about to board the train. That conversation was quickly derailed when Garibaldi stuck his head through my door with that ever-present smile on his face. "Benny, come here. You have to meet the last few members of the Freakshow," he said with excitement. If he didn't like the final members, he wasn't letting it show like the others. Handing Santiago my empty plate and taking my shapeshifter back in his raven form from the desk and putting him on my shoulder, I followed after Garibaldi as he led me toward the door to the outside. "Now, it's for the best if you don't get too close to Matthew, his assistant," he told me as he held the door as if about to open it. I nodded at him since I had already planned not to do so. He gave me a thumbs up and opened the door. Outside, the sun was still shining and it felt like we were still somewhere in my state. We were at a completely abandoned train station with vines and weeds growing everywhere. "Why will we left in France, monsieur?" a muffled French voice asked. Looking out from behind Garibaldi's back, I was met with a man a couple inches shorter than Garibaldi, with a white mask on. The mask had a painted smile on it with only a visible eye hole on the left side with a painted star over the hole. The right side had a blue painted diamond and was completely covered. "I didn't feel like bringing you to America, Matthew," Garibaldi told him matter-of-factly. So bluntly, I let out a little nose laugh from behind him. This caught Matthew's attention as his one eye behind the mask shone and focused on me, sending me quickly behind Garibaldi. "And who's the runt?" he asked, still trying to get a good look at me. Garibaldi sidestepped to reveal me to Matthew, and I was suddenly left without protective cover from the masked Frenchman. Upon being fully revealed to Matthew, I was also shocked to discover that standing next to him was a woman. She was scantily clad with short shorts and a bra. She also had on a see-through blouse, which gave her a modicum of modesty. But for 12-year-old me, this was enough to send me into a blushing fit. She also had a mask on, this one painted red, the reverse of Matthew's mask with the eye hole on the right side and a painted red heart on the left. "This is Benny, the latest addition to the Freakshow. He's our new animal tamer." I gave the duo a half-hearted wave in my best attempt at a smile. "And what exactly happened to Ezekiel?" Matthew asked, as he looked down at me with his singular visible eye. I looked up at Garibaldi to see if there would be any clarification about what happened to the previous animal tamer. "Oh, don't worry about things that don't concern you," Garibaldi said with a smile and a snicker. I couldn't tell what kind of emotions Matthew and the woman had behind their masks, but it was when I started to let my eyes drift back down to the floor that I caught something about the woman standing next to Matthew. And that was the fact that her legs were a completely different color than her body. I lifted my gaze to look at her and realized that she had a completely different lower section sewed to her top section, with a large scar with stitches going around where the two colors clashed. "I'm Matthew. This is my assistant Starla." The woman slowly moved her hand up to wave at me before letting it drop back down like a dead fish. "And these are the aces," he told me, which confused me since I could only see two people in front of me. That was, until a little masked face popped up from behind him. almost like a mirror image of me. The mask didn't have any eye holes or anything, and simply had a playing card club painted on it. Before I could comprehend this, another face popped up from behind Matthew. This one with a diamond painted on it. Another popped up with a giant heart, and finally one with a spade painted on it too. They all quickly rushed out from behind Matthew and approached me. They were an entire foot shorter than me, with messy brown hair and frilly and fluffy blue uniforms, almost like Santiago's clown uniform. The one with clubs painted on his face walked up to me and stared at me for a moment. Before I could say anything to him, he threw his arms around me and hugged me. This didn't feel like a person was hugging me, though, since I could feel nothing but a couple of rods under the frilly and poofy costume. The others all quickly approached me and waved and greeted me in wordless ways. All except the one with the heart painted on his mask. He hung back before being dragged and pulled over to me by the one with diamonds. "That's enough, you four. You can interact with them later. Get on the train, now," Matthew ordered them. They all quickly nodded and rushed onto the train, jumping, cartwheeling, and crawling into the train as quickly as they could. The one with spades on his mask stayed for a moment and quickly handed me something before following after his fellow aces. "You get the entire fourth car to yourselves. I expect not to have a repeat of the Denmark fiasco," Garibaldi told Matthew, as his assistant wordlessly walked past him and got onto the train. The masked man stared at the ringleader before giving him a slight nod and walked on, leaning on his cane a bit as he walked past me. "You can go back to your room now, Benny. You've officially met everyone in the Freakshow," Garibaldi told me excitedly. I nodded at him and gave him a faint smile. "We'll be on the train for a bit longer until we reach our destination in France. So go ahead and go back to your room," he told me, to which I nodded and left him. On my way back to my room, I looked down at the item that the spades had given me. A bottle cap with a smiley face on it, and that got a genuine smile from me. Returning to my room and finding it empty, I let my shapeshifter friend sit on the bed while I sat down at the desk and pulled out some paper. While their leader and assistant had weirded me out to no end, the aces had put a smile on my face and had gotten some real laughs out of me. So I sat down and drew each of them from my memory and decided to give it to them. I looked over to see if the shapeshifter wanted to come with me, but his eyes were closed at that moment, and he looked like he was sleeping. Not wanting to wake him up, I elected to go myself. Walking out into the hallway of the train, I started making my way to the fourth train car. It was when I was almost there that the warnings from Nikolai started floating around in my head. But I wasn't exactly going to deal with Matthew. I was only going to deal with the aces. And I was only dropping off a drawing, so in my mind, it would be all right. Arriving on the fourth train car, I looked around to see which of the rooms the aces were cooped up in. Knocking on the first door, I didn't receive an answer, and thinking that they really couldn't talk to begin with, I decided to see if the door was open. It slid open and I peeked into the room. I let out a surprised yelp when I saw Starless sitting motionless in the corner. I was about to apologize for intruding on her, but she slowly lifted a finger to her painted lips in a shushing motion. I nodded quickly and showed her the drawing I had made. She stared at it for a moment before slowly moving her shushing finger towards me. I thought that she was pointing at me for a moment before I looked behind me and noticed that there was a door there. I mouthed a thank you to her and slowly closed the door. I knocked on the door and waited for a moment. This time, the door opened and Clubs was there to greet me. He stood on top of Heart so he could reach the doorknob. The aces all waved hello to me, and Clubs hopped down off of Hearts as I handed them the drawing I had made of all of them. Diamonds was positively ecstatic at receiving this, since he was jumping all up and down for joy. "I hope you guys like it," I told them with a giggle, as I watched them all pass the drawing between themselves. They all nodded together and waved goodbye to me as I closed their door behind me and left. With my mission completed, I started making my way back to my room. As I opened the door connecting the fourth and fifth car, I ran into Matthew. He was in the process of putting his mask on, and I had arrived just in time before he did so. "You saw me, didn't you?" he asked me. His muffled voice sounded livid at me. I backed up quickly as he let the door close behind him, and followed after me as I backed up in fear of him. My chest tightened as I was suddenly and painfully reminded of the fear that my father gave me whenever he was going to harm me. "No, I didn't see anything," I told him, as I tripped on my feet and tumbled down to the floor with a thud. Already I was instinctively holding my arms up to protect my face. Matthew lifted his cane and smacked the head of it against his gloved hand. "You lying little shit," he hissed at me as he lifted the cane over his head. I was more than sure that I was going to meet a violent and painful end on this train in the middle of nowhere. I had escaped an abusive household just to have met the same fate I would have most likely had if I had just stayed home. "Just what in the hell do you think you're doing?" Garibaldi's voice suddenly broke through the haze of complete fear that had enveloped me. Lowering my arms from my face, I was met with Garibaldi gripping Matthew's cane tightly and preventing the masked Frenchman from bringing it down on me. It was the most angry I had ever seen Garibaldi up to that point. The anger in those multicolored eyes was enough to send a shiver down my soul. He saw my face," Matthew mumbled as he let go of his cane and allowed Antonio to take it from him. Standing up quickly, I rushed over to him and wrapped my arms around him, burying my face into his stomach before I broke down and started crying into his fancy ringleader suit. This was the first time in my life anyone had stopped physical harm from coming to me, and it was something that I was eternally grateful for at the time. "Remember, Matthew?" The way Garibaldi said the Frenchman's name made it seem like it was an insult. "You're only still here because I enjoy your act. I can barely tolerate you. And if you so much as harm Benny or any other member of the troupe, I'll lose any reason of keeping you around. Is that understood?" he asked Matthew. I pulled my face away from Garibaldi and looked up at him. Through my tear-filled eyes, I could have sworn that I saw the scar across his face split open. But upon wiping my eyes, I saw that there wasn't anything there. Matthew wordlessly nodded at Garibaldi, and the ringleader led me back to my room. My shapeshifter friend was waiting there for me. He flapped over to me and landed on my head as I continued to wipe my eyes from the tears that were still leaking from my eyes. I expected a lecture from Antonio, but instead, he removed his hat and ran his hand through his white long hair. "Good thing I got to you in time. I'm sorry if he ruined your day, Benny," he said with a sigh as he tousled my hair and offered me one of those rare, genuine smiles that he possessed. I sniffled as I finally managed to stop the tears from flowing and shook my head at him. "No, it's okay. Are we going to get to perform? I have a lot of cool ideas for animals," I told him with a smile and one final wiping of my eyes and nose. He looked back at me with an excited smile and got right back up on his feet with the same cheery attitude he always had. "I can't wait to see it. We should be arriving at our next destination soon. All we have to do is pitch up our tents and we'll be all set. Keep thinking up some ideas in the meantime. I can't wait to see 'em, Benny," he said with giddy excitement as he hopped and skipped on his way out of my room. The whole interaction got a good laugh out of me, and I sat down on the bed with my raven friend still perched protectively on my head. I looked down at the good luck charm that Zara had given me and smiled. Maybe it had brought me good luck after all. I took the opportunity to try and take a nap until we reached our destination. The train finally stopped after another half an hour, and we all disembarked and began to unload the train once again. Even though it felt like we had only just packed everything up, I didn't complain much at all. The shapeshifter took the form of a snake again and hung around my neck while I helped unload the crates. As I helped open some of them and handed out a few items needed to raise the big top, I snuck a glance over toward the fourth car and watched as Matthew excitedly followed quickly after by Aces and Starla. The Aces did all the unloading, which brought a smile to my face as I watched all of them give their boxes to Hearts, and the big tower of boxes soon came to be even taller than he was. And yet the little guy effortlessly waddled along with this giant load of boxes and followed after his similarly dressed friends as they led him to the location to drop them off. As I watched them with amusement, I wasn't paying attention to where I was sticking my hand. I hadn't noticed that the open box was Nikolai's, and the Russian had a habit of leaving stray knives everywhere. As I stuck my hand into the box without looking, one of these blades sliced open my palm. I pulled out my hand with a loud shout and quickly held it out in front of me. The gash was large and blood began to flow out of it quickly. "This is why we shouldn't bring kids on the circus," Eva's cold, uncaring voice surprised me. I quickly looked over to her as she gracefully descended the train to stare at me. I held my hand and squeezed it to try and stop the bleeding, wincing and whimpering in pain as the German acrobat circled me like some predator playing with its prey. "You must learn to heal your own wounds and take care of that yourself. No one is going to help you but you," she told me. Her cold, uncaring words hurt me almost as badly as a knife had. "Aw, leave him alone, Eva," Santiago shouted at her as he waddled over as quickly as he could with his pigeon-toed feet. Quickly, he kneeled next to me and took my hand to look at it. "He's only 12 years old. Could you stitch up your wounds at 12? The clown asked. This was the first time I'd ever seen him be serious. Judging by Eva's reaction, I guessed that she in fact couldn't stitch her wounds at 12. She hissed in frustration and started walking off in the direction of the rapidly being built tent. Jasper emerged soon after and called out to her to wait for him. "Thank you," I whimpered, as Santiago took a look at my hand. His smile returned, and he gave me a little giggle. "Don't worry about it. I've had to deal with Nikolai's stray knives more than you could ever guess." Letting my hand go, he rolled up his long sleeves and showed me the many scars across them. "I've had a lot of practice with this," he assured me, as he took a hold of my hand again and produced a needle and thread from under his clown hat. In what must have been some sort of speed record, he fixed up the gash on my palm in no time at all. "Thank you," I repeated to him, once he had thoroughly examined the wound. He nodded quickly and put his supplies back under his clown hat. He told me to tell Abigail and that she would have some disinfectant spray to make sure I didn't get some kind of infection. He then waddled away to go and yell at Nikolai about having left a knife just out and about. Holding my throbbing and pained hand out in front of me, I started trying to find where Abigail was. But before I could do so, I was quickly approached by the Aces. It seemed that they had overheard what had happened to me and had brought me some things to cheer me up. Spades was the first, quickly handing me a chocolate bar before running away to the back of the line. Clubs and Diamonds both got me Band-Aids, and Hearts, after being shoved forward by everyone else, gave me some disinfectant spray. Thanking them all, I watched as they all quickly went back to work unloading their part of the train. After a rather painful application of the disinfectant spray, I cautiously went back to unloading the crate that I had been emptying. Suddenly, there was a commotion coming over from the front of the train. I hurried over to join everyone else, as seemingly everyone from the Freakshow was gathered around. We didn't pack this, did we?" Edgar asked as he scratched his head. His brother looked nervous like he always did, but now it seemed even more so than usual. Before us all was a large crate, but it didn't look like the same as the crates we used. This one was painted completely black and had no markings at all to indicate where it had come from. "Was it left here for us?" Jasper asked as he circled the crate. He knocked on it softly, and we all stood around waiting for something to happen. "Why has everyone stopped working?" Garibaldi asked in confusion as he stepped down from the train engine. We all looked over at him and then parted so he could see the strange crate that had us all confused. At first, he looked just as confused as us, before his face suddenly lit up in absolute excitement. "Oh, it's finally here!" he practically screamed, shoving all of us out of the way to get to it. As he did so, I finally got a view of the mystery conductor engineer, and I instantly ran to hide behind Abigail, causing a surprised jolt out of her. Standing at the door up to the engine car was a corpse, rotted and infested with maggots, and the only thing to show that he was supposed to be there was a little conductor hat placed on his skeletal head. It looked over at me and raised an arm to the hat, taking it off and tipping it to me. I let out a blood-curdling scream when I laid eyes on the rotting corpse. I was able to keep some sort of composure around the bandwagon, but to see a full-on human corpse was just too much for me. I fell to the floor and cried out in fear at the body. My screams were enough to pull everyone's attention from the mystery crate over to me. "Betty, it's okay, sweetie," Abigail told me, as she quickly fell to her knees with me and wrapped her arms around me, shoving my face into her chest. "You don't want to see this part," she told me softly, as a sudden noise of falling pieces and rattling objects hitting metal filled my ears. Peeking out from behind Abigail, I saw that the corpse had completely fallen apart into a pile of bones and meat. The maggots squirmed and writhed around in the pile, more than happy to continue their feast as they did so. "That part doesn't ever get any easier." Taking some deep breaths like Abigail told me to, I finally started to calm down and pull my attention away from where the walking corpse conductor had been. I pulled my attention back over to the mystery crate, where Garibaldi had not so much as looked in my direction after I had screamed and was still jumping around the box and making strange chirping noises at it. Who's it from, sir?" I asked him through teary eyes and a few hiccups. He looked over at me with wild excitement in his eyes and a violent twitch from his head. "Oh, well, it's from my best friend in the whole wide world, King Creole," he said with giddy excitement. I scratched my head at that, but everyone in the Freakshow suddenly had looks of complete fear. "Who's that?" I asked, just as the box began to shake about and rapid knocking could be heard from inside of it. The mysterious black crate began to tremble and shake around violently, sending everyone in the troupe away from it just as quickly as they had all gathered around it. When Garibaldi had announced it was a gift from someone named King Creole, the look on the other members of the troupe was enough for me to gather that, whoever that was, he probably wasn't good. "With all due respect, boss," Nikolai spoke up, being the spokesperson for everyone else. "Anytime that guy sends you something, it always ends up being something horrible." Everyone in the troupe nodded, and I looked up at Abigail for confirmation. She looked down at me and offered a simple shrug and nod. Garibaldi, on the other hand, never looked more offended in his life. He angrily turned his attention back over to us and crossed his arms at us. "Name one thing that Creole has sent us that's so horrible," he said with a pout, tapping his foot on the ground and squashing a few of the maggots that had crawled over to him from the remains of the train conductor. What about that piece of bread with multiple eyeballs?" Edgar spoke up. His brother quickly nodded along with the perpetual look of worry plastered on his face. "It showed up in a box one day, ate all our food, screamed at us, and then ran away." Everyone nodded along like that was a completely normal thing to have happened to them. And stole one of Nikolai's knives." Alan quickly nodded. The first time he'd ever spoken since I'd joined the Freakshow. "Oh, that's harmless. Besides, without Creole, Starla would have been killed with all of Matthew's accidents. Just look at her. She's never been better." Tony pointed to the masked woman, who barely even acknowledged that she was being talked about. I stared at her while everyone continued trying to plead with Antonio to not open the crate. Whoever this Creole person was he the one who'd sewn the different-colored lower half of Starla's body? She must have taken notice of my staring at her, as she slowly moved her head over to stare at me. The single eye hole in her mask glimmered like a star as she stared. Our short staring contest was interrupted when the loud snapping of wood pulled everyone's attention back over to the crate. The crate had seemingly grown tired of waiting around for someone to open it and decided to just open itself as the wood snapped and broke all around it. The four walls of the crate fell to the sides like a flower opening up a whole bunch of confetti, and streamers came billowing out of the center of the box. At the center of the box was a man, dressed in a brown suit with a red tie. His skin was silky green with black spots on a few parts of his face. His right eye was bloodshot and almost completely red, while he possessed no left eye. And most disturbing of all was that a permanent smile had been stitched into his mouth. The stitches kept the corners of his mouth forced into a disgustingly morbid smile. This would have already been a horrible present if not for the hand puppet that was attached to his left hand. "I told you, something horrible," Nikolai said, as he held one of his many knives in front of him. And all of us were pretty much hiding behind him. And then the corpse stiffened to attention and turned to face us. The haunting smile and vacant eye hole was enough to start sending me into another fear-induced panic attack. "You ain't so good-looking either, comrade," a high-pitched voice insulted Nikolai back. The whole troupe fell silent except for Santiago, who was doing his best to not burst out into laughter, giggling into his oversized sleeves. The corpse raised its hand puppet to us, allowing for a better look at what it was. A multicolored jester, with a simple smiley face stared back at us, and we were all baffled about where the voice had come from. "Did that thing just talk?" Eva asked, trying to hide behind Jasper, who in turn was trying to hide behind her. The arm connected to the jester jerked in their direction, causing a scared yelp out of both of them. "I have a name, thank you very much," the voice told them, and soon we noticed that the voice was coming from the puppet itself. "The name's Maxwell. This here is my handyman, Jester." The puppet introduced themselves. The corpse dipped his head slightly, but more so as a consequence of the hand puppet than from any input from him. "Oh, how wonderful!" Garibaldi clapped his hands together and snickered uncontrollably, even throwing a few of those strange chirping noises he had been making since the crate had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. He practically skipped over to Maxwell and Jester and examined them both up and down. "Creole had been telling me that he wanted to give me a new member." What the hell is he supposed to do? And tell shitty jokes? Matthew asked. The anger was obvious even from behind his mask. Garibaldi snapped his head toward the Frenchman and looked like he was about to tear him limb from limb. But before he could do so, the hand puppet giggled uncontrollably. Oh, I can do more than that. Chester isn't just for transportation, you know. Maxwell moved around on Chester's arm, sending the whole corpse wiggling and waggling around as the hand puppet jerked about. Holding the arm up high, we all stared at Maxwell as he seemingly melted into Chester's arm. His colorful costume spread down Chester's arm as it seemed to be taking over the corpse's body. The corpse suddenly sprung to life, but now, instead of jerky and uncanny movements, he was much more animated. As the Jester form slowly overtook the body, it was obvious to us what Maxwell had meant about Chester. Combined, we make? The Jester's voice was a strange echo of two voices, one being Maxwell's high-pitched voice, and the other being a low-pitched, hollow voice. Mac and cheese, the Jester said with excitement, as the transformation completed and a fully fledged and dressed-up Jester stood before us all. His floppy hat jingled with the 2 golden bells and 2 more rang from his curved shoes. The face that was once green and rotting was now replaced with bright white makeup with 2 red-painted cheeks, and the vacant eye socket was now occupied by some strange glowing iris. "Oh, how wonderful!" Garibaldi exclaimed in absolute joy as he skipped over to the Jester, along with Santiago, who was practically about to explode with his excitement. "Creole truly does know how to spoil me," Garibaldi snickered excitedly, as he moved aside for Santiago to begin taking the Jester's ear off. I looked at the other members of the troupe and was glad to see I wasn't the only one who was more than a little concerned by the new member. I held on to Abigail tightly as she quickly ushered me to help her unpack the remaining boxes of items from the train. We all left the Jester with Santiago and the Aces, who had all also come running up to greet the newest member. I took the wide way around the train to avoid the sight of the rotten and abandoned corpse and began helping Abigail and the twins to unpack everything. It was then that I noticed something. "Does Mr. Garibaldi not have any luggage?" I asked them. Abigail looked at me and then over at the twins. Edgar and Alan both shrugged their shoulders at her. He unloads his stuff before we can get to it," Edgar told me, swearing something fierce, when Alan accidentally struck his thumb with the hammer that he was using to nail up one of the posts that held down the tent. "Must be pretty protective, huh?" I said with a weak chuckle, and turning to help them with their work, the question gnawing at the back of my head. I didn't know anything about Garibaldi. From talking to the few people I was growing close to in the Freakshow, I was getting to know them, but Garibaldi was still a mystery to me, and Zara's cryptic warnings weren't being of much help. All of her warnings about mantises pointed at Garibaldi. After all, he had several mantis items on him, the most blatant being the golden pin stuck in his top hat. Benny! Santiago's excited voice yanked me away from my inquisitive thoughts. "Me and the Aces have an idea. Well, I had one, but they seem to really like it, so come on." He yanked and tugged on me, practically dragging me away from Abigail and the twins. They seemed fine with the idea, so I didn't have much choice in the matter. The idea turned out that we should all perform together. Since we were all more or less dressed as clowns, Santiago had gotten the idea that we should all perform with each other. The Aces were more than a little excited. Diamonds and Spades were so excited, in fact, that they were all jumping up and down the moment I arrived at their little grouping. Just as we started to plan out a giant act together, Matthew came walking over with Starla in tow with him. "Just what do you think you're doing?" he asked with disdain. I quickly avoided his masked gaze before accidentally finding myself staring at Starla. She continued to stare at me, and I could feel the shimmering eye burning deep into my soul. Well, we're planning on, doing an act with the aces," Santiago said with a forced laugh. It was the first time that I'd seen Santiago be uncomfortable with a person. Sure, he had stood up for me against Eva, but he hadn't been uncomfortable around her. I could tell just by his response to the Frenchman that he wanted to talk to him as little as physically possible. "Oh, don't even think about it. We already have our act set up, and I won't have you two stupid clowns running it. All of you, back with me," Matthew said. All the aces looked at each other before they all began walking over to their master. Spades stopped first, however, and turned to me. He quickly gave me a wave goodbye before waddling after the other members of his group. I could tell Santiago was upset at his idea being overruled, so I quickly reassured him that I would still love to do something with him. That perked him right up, and he quickly began waddling off himself to go and talk to Nikolai about incorporating me and the shapeshifter into their act. The shapeshifter had remained a raven this whole time, being quite still on my shoulder and not acting up much at all. But when we both turned to go back on the train and get the sheet of paper where I had written down all of our ideas, we both let out sounds of surprise when we noticed Starla was still standing in the exact place she'd been standing the whole time. She quickly reached out and gripped my arm as tightly as she possibly could. Her nails dug into my flesh and got me to whimper in pain. She yanked me close to her, quickly looking around her and pushing her masked face up against me. "Check his office. He isn't who you think he is," she told me in a voice that could barely be qualified as a whisper. She was so quiet, I hadn't been sure that she had spoken words to me at all. With that said, she simply let my arm go and walked away to seemingly rejoin Matthew and the aces. I was left more than a little rattled by the events that had all transpired in so short a time, from seeing Bandwagon up close, to seeing a rotten corpse drive a train, to seeing a corpse be possessed by a living hand puppet. It was all a little too much for a 12-year-old, and I still had a performance to do. I got a quick peck on the ear from the shapeshifter to set me on my path, quickly reboarding the train and making sure to avoid both Matthew's car and Bandwagon's. I ran to my room to pick up a list of things I had written out and was on the way to rejoin Santiago when I was met with Maxwell and Chester back in their original form. "Oh, Benny, my boy," Maxwell said excitedly as he shoved his little face into mine. "Garibaldi has told me so much about you, and I must say, I am impressed," the little Jester hand puppet said with a few giggles in between his words. I was more than a little uncomfortable, especially with a constantly smiling corpse just a few feet away from me, as the puppet jerked the arm around and caused the stiff corpse to sway back and forth. "Yeah, I need to go practice," I told him, before trying to slide past him. But before I could, I was quickly grabbed by the shoulder and found myself face to face with the full-size Jester once again. "Let go of me," I shouted, trying to bash my way out of his grip. "But you were about to step on him," the Jester told me, and pointed to the floor. His strange duo voice caught me off guard, but soon I followed to where he was pointing and was surprised to see one of the aces laying face down on the floor. I looked back at the Jester and then back down at the fallen ace. "Oh, are you okay?" I asked him. The little guy lifted his head and looked over at me. The big blue heart on his mask clued me into the fact that he was Hearts. Upon seeing both of us, Hearts did what I could best describe as a silent scream before quickly standing up and running away down the hall. We both watched as the other 3 aces all poked their heads out from the nearby door and quickly waved to us before chasing after the fleeing hearts. "Aw, didn't want you stepping on the poor guy," Mac and Cheese told me, before he released me with a giggle and a quick tussle of my hair. "Well, we need to go and practice, and I bet you have to do the same. I'm looking forward to seeing your great performance, Mr. Ramirez," the Jester said with a wink at me as he walked away, his bells jingling with each step. I was left frozen in place as I watched him walk away. How did he know my last name? I hadn't even told Garibaldi my last name. I hadn't told anyone in the Freakshow my whole name. Maxwell and Chester had only just arrived, and they somehow knew. I quickly asked the shapeshifter to turn into a dog and had him follow me back to Santiago. I felt safer knowing I had my protector close to me. As the day quickly passed and we finally got the big top all set up, we finally got a few hours to practice our acts, while Garibaldi spent most of his time laughing and socializing with Maxwell and Chester. I won't deny that I felt a little jealous over the attention that the Jester and the courts were getting from Garibaldi. It was like being replaced with a new toy, and it made me more upset than I thought it would. But for the time being, I occupied myself with helping Santiago and Nikolai come up with a new performance. "Oh, what about we have him turn into a bull?" Santiago said with giddy excitement, as he looked at the list of ideas I had written down on the train ride to France. "Oh, we could strap me to the horns and have him run at the wall." I couldn't help but wince at the idea. I would have rather not seen him smushed into a clown pancake. "You're not a stuntman, Santi," Nikolai sighed as he sat on the box. His metallic prosthetic was removed from his leg stump and lying in his lap while he did maintenance on it. "I mean, you sort of are, but not that kind," the Russian chuckled as he used a screwdriver to tighten the screws in his leg. I took the list from Santiago and looked at everything I had written here and tried to find a way to combine our 2 acts. Turning to my shapeshifter, I was about to ask him a question, but then realized he was staring intently off into the distance. Waving my hand in front of his red eyes, I got his attention and a few surprised croaks from the raven. I smiled at him and gave his head a little rubbing with my finger. I also took that opportunity to look over to see what he was staring at. He'd been staring at Starla, who, along with Matthew and the aces, were on the far side of the tent away from everyone else also practicing their act. I avoided Starla's glimmering eye hole and went back to the list, racking my brain with how to combine them. When at last it hit me, Nikolai and Santiago were both ecstatic with the idea, and we quickly went about practicing it. And by the time our performances were about to begin, we had perfectly honed our set. Santiago took me backstage to help with my makeup again, and we passed by a bandwagon as it sat in its red wagon ready to begin playing its music. "I don't like it," I told Santiago, as we quickly moved past the mountain of flesh, faces, and hands. Santiago simply shrugged as he pigeon-toed along next to me. "Oh, they aren't that bad. They just play music, that's it. They may look horrifying, but they're very docile." I wasn't so sure about that, but I had bigger things to worry about as Santiago applied my clown makeup, and I could hear the sounds of French people starting to fill up the Freakshow. I held the necklace that Zara had given me in my hand as Santiago finished up the last few brushstrokes of my makeup. I hoped that everything would turn out all right. Garibaldi announced our performance in French, which would make sense since we were in France after all. And to my surprise, it was Matthew and Starla up first. But as I thought it over, it did make more sense. Matthew was French after all. He began his set speaking in French to the audience before turning to Starla and taking from her gloved hands a deck of cards. and I watched with amazement as the masked Frenchman caused all of the cards in the deck to fly around him in large, spinning circles. From my spot backstage, I got a great view of them flying around the big top like a flock of birds. After a few amazing card tricks, including Matthew launching the entire deck of cards out of his hand, and all of them landing perfectly into the shape of the Eiffel Tower, he next turned to Starla. As if on cue, a large box was pushed onto stage. It was one of the kinds that you saw someone in half, and I suddenly got nervous. If Starla's lower half was anything to go off of, I thought for sure Matthew would do something to her. Starla entered the box without so much as a peep and closed it as she lay down in it. Matthew removed the top hat he'd been wearing for this performance, and instead of pulling out a rabbit, he pulled out an entire fire axe from inside it. I can't watch," I quickly whimpered as I hid my eyes behind my hands. But Santiago quickly shook me back and forth. I lowered my hands just in time to see Matthew bring the axe down on the box and split it completely in half. The two sections of the box rolled away from each other, and the lids came off both of them, revealing the aces inside. I beamed excitedly at seeing them and quickly grabbed Santiago and shook him back and forth this time. The aces all stacked on top of each other and yoinked the hat from Matthew as they did so, clubs being at the very top, but the hat on his head and I watched with amazement as they were all swallowed up by the hat. Each one disappeared under it until just the hat was sitting there on the stage. Matthew went over to pick it up, and from under the hat, Starlight came out completely fine and posing for the audience. "That's why Tony keeps him around," Santiago told me as we started getting ready. I could see why, as the show had been wonderful and awe-inspiring. Matthew spoke a few more words in French before he again tossed a very large amount of cards into the air, and he and Starla disappeared underneath the flurry of hundreds of cards, leaving only Matthew's hat behind, which was quickly scooped up by Eva as she went past swinging on her trapeze swing. She placed the hat on her head as she let go of her swing and began to somersault in the air. Jasper then came swinging over to catch her quickly. The two of them then both launched themselves into the air and soon landed on Abigail's shoulders. I was worried for her, as it looked like she was struggling to keep balance with both of them on her, but she quickly found her footing and continued walking the tightrope as Eva and Jasper began to argue as they sat down on her shoulders. This ended with Eva shoving Jasper off and then leaning back and allowing herself to fall backwards with him. She caught him by the foot and grabbed onto a nearby swing and swung them both around the circumference of the big top. As she was doing this, I was quickly helping to strap Santiago into his wheel before quickly hiding myself and my shapeshifter behind it. When the spotlight shone on us, I sat and waited as Nikolai began chucking the first few knives at Santiago. It was the same routine until Nikolai suddenly produced two knives at once and tossed them both at Santiago. The two blades struck each other and set off sparks that showered the wooden wheel, and that was my cue. I stood up and tossed the shapeshifter into the air and watched with amazement as he morphed into a mystical black phoenix. The black flaming bird flapped into the air for a moment before starting to circle the tent and amaze everyone there. I stepped out from behind the wheel and called for him to return after a few passes. The shapeshifter came flapping down and turned into his usual raven form. I had meant for him to land on my arm like a falcon does, but instead, he landed on my head. But the resulting laughter from the crowd was worth it. Maxwell and Jester had been set up with their booth outside much like the twins in Zara, so after our performance was done, we were allowed to take our rest. Everyone had loved the performance, and I was more than happy to see all of the aces rushing over to me and hopping up and down in place with excitement. As I laughed at them, I looked over at Starla and remembered her cryptic warning. I'd asked Santiago where Garibaldi's office was, and I was quickly told it was off limits to everyone. And that did nothing but pique my 12-year-old curiosity. Sneaking away from everyone, I started to wander around to try and discover where Garibaldi's office may have been located. I didn't exactly have a lot to go off of, but the darkness of night and the sounds of French people enjoying themselves were enough to mask my efforts in locating the elusive location. I asked the shapeshifter to turn into a mouse before quickly placing him in my pocket, so as not to have anyone notice a trail of feathers he might leave behind. I started my search by where we all shared rooms. We all had rooms there, but Garibaldi was the one exception. He didn't have a room, which made me think that he had slept in his office, or at the very least, he had a bedroom inside of it. Wandering outside the tent, I tried to think of where the office might be when my eye wandered over towards the train. I figured I might as well check there since it was the only other place I could think of where his office might be. Quickly sneaking over to the locomotive, I quickly climbed aboard and began going through all the train cars. Being sure not to stay in Matthew's train car for too long, I soon came upon a section near the caboose. A simple-looking wooden door with a plaque that read, "Tony's office," stared back at me, with an ominous "Stay out" underneath it. Taking a quick look behind me to make sure no one had followed me or was watching me, I reached out to grab the doorknob and was amazed to watch it open when I turned and pushed on it. Inside, it was immediately obvious that this was no ordinary office. But what exactly on the train was normal anyway? Inside of the train car was exceptionally bigger than it had been on the outside. It almost looked like the lobby of a hotel, with even a loft overlooking the entire scene. Scattered around everywhere were mantis decorations, from simple statues to pictures to even a bejeweled mantis fountain. "He really likes mantises," I said, with a little apprehension as I entered and closed the door behind me. Walking around the office, it was quickly obvious to me that Garibaldi needed to clean up. Broken furniture and various scraps and pieces of paper littered the floor as I made my way over to his desk. Taking a seat in his velvet chair, I took a look at his desk and looked around at the few things he had. A framed picture quickly caught my attention as it looked like it had Garibaldi and a woman on it. Thinking back, I had seen before that he always wore a wedding ring, but I had never given it much thought about who that might be, or if she was even here at the Freakshow. Reaching out to grab the picture, I stopped in my tracks when I saw the poster hidden underneath one of the mantis statues on his desk. I moved the statue and took the poster out from underneath it. "This is me," I said to myself as I stared down at my face on the poster. A missing person poster had been made for me. This whole time, I believed that my parents hadn't cared for me in the slightest. While I'm sure that it might have been true for my dad, I thought back to my mom. I gripped the poster as a wave of emotions overcame me, but before I could act on any of it, I was interrupted by a shriek that snapped me out of it. Scared out of my mind, I quickly dove underneath Garibaldi's desk and covered my mouth to stop any screams from escaping it. I heard the door to the office swing open and quickly slammed shut as someone's panting breath came in and quickly tripped and tumbled over the mess of destroyed furniture. I started crawling away from the desk to try to get a better hiding spot when a second thing entered the office and started hissing and chirping. I couldn't understand the person screaming for their life since they were speaking terrified French, but I could tell that whoever they were scared for their life. I started crawling across the floor quickly as I made my way over to a nearby couch. As I did so, I caught a glimpse of the man also crawling across the floor, but he didn't notice me. He was much more focused on whatever was attacking him at the moment. Whatever that was suddenly swooped down from somewhere and landed on the couch right above me. I froze in my tracks and quickly covered my mouth again and shut my eyes, more than sure that I was about to die right there. But when I opened my eyes again, I saw that I was still alive, and the creature was no longer on top of me. I quickly started crawling away and towards the open office door, and as I did so, suddenly the light shut off, and the Frenchman let out a louder scream which would quickly mix in with gurgling. Taking the chance, I got on my feet and began running. I made it to the door and was confused to find that I wasn't back on the train, but at the big top tent exiting the door that was usually used to access backstage. The floodlights were still on in the big top, and the sudden, bright, vibrant lights stopped me in my tracks for a moment. As I turned my head to shield my eyes from the light, I looked back into the office, and I saw the silhouette of the monster, an enormous mantis-shaped creature with bright, vibrant eyes. I let out a scream as I sprinted out of the office and fled as fast as my 12-year-old legs could carry me. I expected to be tackled and killed by the monster, but as I ran and glanced behind me, I noticed I wasn't being followed. I ran as fast as I could to my room, quickly shutting the door behind me, and dove into my bed, pulling the covers over my head and hoping for their protection. I must have fallen asleep afterward because my next memory is waking up the next day completely exhausted and looking for my shapeshifter friend. Looking into the pocket where I had placed him, I found that there was nothing there. Getting out of bed and quickly getting the makeup off of my face, I stepped out into the entire Freakshow, out into the middle of the tent hall. "But Benny, there you are," Abigail said through tears, as she quickly wrapped her arms around me and gave me a tight squeeze. Nikolai and Santiago were also glad to see me, but they also seemed to be blocking me from seeing what everyone else had gathered to see. "What's going on?" I asked them, trying to see past what the other members had all gathered over. Nikolai and Santiago looked at each other before looking over at Abigail, who was busy trying to regain some kind of composure. "Starla had an accident. That dumb bitch got split in half again. At least this time her legs are right there," Eva said. I could tell she was trying to keep up her tough, mean girl persona, but the look on her face told me how bad it was. I pushed past Nikolai and Santiago to see what had happened to Starla, and was met with her cut in half and staring at me with her mask still on. She didn't have any internal organs or anything inside of her body. She looked like a doll that had been played with too roughly. I swallowed some bile that was starting to build up in my throat and started backing away. Everything was suddenly starting to make sense to me. Zara's warning started to filter back into my mind. "The mantis awaits in the giant flower that you live in." The giant flower I lived in. The bright, multicolored big top tent, or even the brightly painted trains. And the mantis? "Benny, can I speak to you for a moment?" Garibaldi asked me, as I felt his hand rest on my shoulder and give it a hard squeeze. Before I could even answer Garibaldi, I was being pulled away from the rest of the troupe as they stayed behind to assess what was left of Starla. I was so petrified with fear that I didn't even try to escape from the grip he had on my shoulder, as he pulled me along down the hallway and into one of the vacant rooms. He let go of my shoulder, and I quickly backed away from him as he looked down at me. "Do you have something to tell me, Benny?" the ringmaster asked me, as he crossed his arms and stared down at me like a disapproving father. I tried to avoid his gaze, but the overwhelming fear and anxiety forced my eyes back up to meet his. To my surprise, though, I didn't immediately see anger on his face. It was disappointment for sure, but it wasn't outright anger and malice. "I went into your office," I told him, barely above a whisper. I kept my gaze on his, waiting for immediate retaliation from him. But it didn't happen right away. He sighed in disbelief instead, and rubbed his temples with his fingers. "Benny," he said, as he lowered his hand to his side. "You know you aren't allowed in there." He looked down at me, and I detected an immediate shift in him. "So why the hell did you go in there?" I was suddenly transported back to my old home, with my father looming over me with murderous intent. I just wanted to know about you," I lied to him. It wasn't a complete lie, but it was the only thing I could think to tell him that might lessen any blow he might give me. But it was clear that my petty excuse wasn't going to cut it, as his anger was complete and total. "The sign is there for a reason, you brat." With this outburst of anger, I watched in horror as the scar across Garibaldi's face split open. Instead of pouring out of the now gaping hole in his head, I watched as a row of sharp teeth made their presence known as they emerged from inside the scar. I let out a horrified scream as I watched the scar start to split further open. When I did this, it must have snapped Garibaldi out of his rage-induced stupor, as the scar quickly closed and the teeth receded into it. "Benny, I'm so sorry," he suddenly told me, back to his normal self all of a sudden. I quickly backed up away from him, as I felt a well of tears starting to fall down my cheek as he tried approaching me. "Step away from me," I yelled at him feebly. That seemed to hurt his feelings somewhat, as I saw his shoulders droop slightly. He fidgeted with his hands, and I watched his fingers instinctively go to his wedding ring and begin to fiddle with it. There has to be a way for me to make it up to you. I didn't mean to lose my temper on you," he pleaded with me, spinning the ring around his finger. It seemed like he was beating himself up pretty hard over causing me to cry in fear. I thought back to when I had been inside his office, and of the framed picture on Garibaldi's desk. "Do you have a wife, sir?" I asked him through a sniffling nose. His fidgeting stopped, and he looked over at me with a speed that I thought for sure would snap his neck. He looked down at his hands, and quickly let them drop to his side. "I did," he told me, letting those two words hang in the air for a while. "If I tell you about it, will you forgive me for scaring you?" he asked me, rubbing his white and black hair. I hesitantly nodded at him. It wouldn't really, but I wanted to know more about him, and if keeping him off the topic of me going into his office also came from this, even better. He let out a long, exasperated sigh, which turned into the strange chirping he did sometimes. "Her name was Lucille. She was my everything. She saw the good in everything, and she saw what little good there was in me, and made me see that there was some good in me. I met her after I was on the run from the law, and she took me in and cared for me." He sounded like a completely different person talking about her. His normally laid-back and uncaring attitude was replaced with one of soft remembrance, almost like the wild creature had been tamed. "It was the happiest I'd ever been in so long. She completed me. She was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. And then I lost her." He sighed shakily, lifting his hand to his eyes and letting another shaky sigh fall out of his mouth. "What happened to her?" I asked him. A rather insensitive question to ask, I'll admit, but one which I desperately wanted answered. He looked over at me and looked like he was reliving some horrible nightmare all over again. "A terrible accident." That was all he told me, before he quickly changed the subject. "We wanted to start a family so badly, but I couldn't do it with her, so So I decided to start the Freakshow to fill that void that she left behind. Whatever rage he had felt towards me evaporated as he seemed lost to his memories of Lucille. I dried my eyes and wiped my nose with my sleeves as we both stood awkwardly away from each other. "I'm sorry I went into your office," I told him after a long, awkward silence. My words snapped him out of his stupor, and he looked over at me and mumbled something inaudible at me before turning and leaving me alone in the spare room. I waited there until I heard his footsteps fade away before exiting and walking back to my room. Upon entering the door, I was shocked to find my shapeshifter friend waiting for me on my desk in his usual raven form. In the chaos and confusion of everything that had happened, I had completely forgotten that he'd gone missing. He croaked at me, and I was happy to see he was all right. I offered him my arm, and he flapped over to me, perching himself on my arm like a falcon. I didn't leave my room for several hours. I couldn't bear to face anyone at that moment, and I didn't even bother trying to go and get breakfast. I just sat in a corner of the room with my shapeshifter friend, petting him softly and occasionally asking him to turn into something for me, usually something small and fuzzy like a bunny or a squirrel. It was starting to be about noon when Abigail poked her head into my room to check on me. "Benny, sweetheart, you need to eat something," she told me, as she opened the door to my room and brought with her a bowl of oatmeal and some milk. When I saw her, I just felt more guilty over what I had done. It felt like I had gotten Starla killed, and the feeling of guilt was weighing heavily on me. Letting my shapeshifter friend down on the floor, I curled into a ball and just shook my head at her. "It's all my fault," I told her through barely held back tears. I heard her set the bowl down, and then the sound of her straining to sit down with me. Before I could say anything else, I felt myself be picked up and placed in her lap. Her hand rested on my hair and tousled it back and forth as she held me. "What's your fault, sweetheart?" she asked, rocking me back and forth and making me feel like I was safer than I'd ever been before in my life. I shoved my face into her soft body and just began crying uncontrollably into her. She patted me on the back and softly shushed me as I let the tears flow fully and uncontrolled for the first time in a long time. "It's my fault Starla died," I told her through gasps of air. She suddenly stopped rocking me and carefully pushed me off of her chest. She was looking at me with a bit of confusion. Her vitiligo-covered face examined me as she tried to figure out what I meant. "Benny, sweetheart, Starla is fine," she told me, which stopped my crying right then and there. "Well, I mean, not exactly fine, but she isn't dead. Tony is calling his friend right now to help fix her. Starla is... well, she's like a doll. She gets broken sometimes, and Tony has to fix her from time to time," she reassured me, wiping the tears still flowing from my eyes. "So, she's okay?" I asked Abigail, and she responded with a nod and a soft pinch of my cheek. I wiped my eyes and nose with a hanky that she provided me and sat in her lap eating the oatmeal she got for me a bit, just enjoying her company and her reassurances that it hadn't been my fault. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been my fault. After I finished the bowl, she took my dirty dishes and left me alone after I assured her that I was okay being by myself. Once she'd left, I looked back over at my shapeshifter friend and asked him to turn into a snake form again. After he did, I picked him up and coiled him around my neck. Leaving my room and closing the door behind me, I started making my way back over towards the big top. I half-heartedly waved at the few people I saw, including Santiago and Nikolai. I learned from the twins, more really Edgar, that tonight's show was canceled on account of Starla's injury and that everyone was given a day off. I asked Edgar about where Garibaldi was, but he didn't know and Alan didn't either. So I went on my way, wanting to apologize more thoroughly to him, and also wanted to know how in the world he was going to fix Starla. But from everyone I asked, None of them had seen him since he first dragged me away. I was about to give up and go back to my room when the solution quite literally hit me. One of the aces came rolling at me from behind and toppled me over. The ace in question was Hearts, which didn't surprise me at all because he'd seemed to be the one that the others all enjoyed bullying. The other aces all came walking over and excitedly waved at me. They all seemed to have missed me, and I would have been lying if I said I hadn't missed them. "Do you guys know where Garibaldi is?" I asked them, as I picked Hearts up and set him down, stunned at how thin and light he was. All of them nodded quickly and pointed in various directions. Clubs looked at all the other aces and bonked each of them on the head. The others all quickly nodded and pointed correctly towards Maxwell and Chester's tent. "Thanks, guys," I told them, reaching into my pocket and handing them some crayons I had brought to give them. They all excitedly took them, each of them getting a different color, with poor Hearts ending up with the white one. Leaving them to do with the crayons what they wished, I made my way towards Maxwell and Chester's tent. As I got closer to it, I started hearing voices coming from inside. Getting down low, I stuck my head into the tent and was once again amazed with how much bigger inside it was than it appeared outside. Maxwell and Chester's tent was adorned with balloons and streamers and seemed like prime birthday party material. Following the sounds of the voices, I contemplated if I should wait for Garibaldi to finish. But an unknown third voice that suddenly started speaking from further in the tent just pulled me towards its source. I dropped down to my hands and knees and started quickly crawling my way towards its source. "I know this is sudden, but I need your help," I heard Garibaldi say in exasperation. I rounded a corner and saw that Garibaldi and Mac and Cheese were standing around a table with Starla strapped down to it. On the table was a phone that I assumed was on speaker, since a soft southern accented voice was speaking through it, even though the receiver was in its hung-up position. "I can't exactly be there anytime soon, Antonio," the voice over the phone told Garibaldi, which was annoying him because he wasn't explicitly angry with it. "I can't exactly leave the shop alone and waltz my way into your lovely show. What if a customer comes in? You should just hire a new store clerk at this point, as long as you've had your fun with the last one," Garibaldi snickered, joined by chuckling on the other end and even a laugh from Mac and Cheese. "True. Perhaps I should look into getting a new clerk. Poor Jose didn't last very long before he lost his mind. I'm rather bored with him," the southern voice sighed from the other end of the phone. Whoever was on the other end, it was clear to me that he and Garibaldi were friends with how laid back and calm he looked while talking over the phone. "Oh, please, Creole, I need her fixed before tomorrow's show. I already had to cancel today's one, and I for sure will not do that again. I have my reputation to think of," he said dramatically, but I could tell he was acting it up ever so slightly. The exaggeration got a good chuckle out of the voice that I assumed was Creole, the mystery man who had sent Mac and Cheese to us. "Oh, well, I can walk you through a spell that could help you. You'd need Maxwell and Chester for it." The Jester stood dutifully at attention when his two separate halves were mentioned. His bells jingled as he did so, including Creole to the fact that he was there. "Let me call you back once I find the correct ingredients. It shouldn't be too long." He hung up and Garibaldi let out a long, exasperated sigh. "Can you leave me alone for a moment? I feel like my head is gonna explode," Garibaldi asked of the Jester, who quickly nodded and cartwheeled himself away, which got a giggle from Garibaldi and myself watching him do so. I was about to make my presence known when I suddenly heard the loud clacking of a cane coming towards me. I quickly tucked and rolled my way under a nearby table, hoping that whoever was approaching hadn't seen me. "Antonio!" Matthew's heavily French-accented voice shouted as he walked past my hiding spot and rounded the corner. And quickly sneaking out from under the table, I scurried over to the corner to see what was going to happen. "Oh, not now, Matthew. You're the last person I want to deal with at the moment," Garibaldi told him, as he turned to leave the room through a door behind him. Before he could, though, the table that Starla was on moved on its own and slammed itself against the door and blocked Garibaldi's path of exit. "Not until you fix Starla first," Matthew said, as he lowered his arm and walked up to Garibaldi. "Your childish tantrum broke her and caused you to cancel today's performance, so you better fix her now," the Frenchman demanded, getting right up into Garibaldi's face and poking his finger into his chest. "I'm trying to fix her. This shit just can't happen right away, Matthew. Not to mention, I wouldn't have needed to break her if she hadn't told Benny to go into my office," Garibaldi snarled back, as he shoved Matthew away from him and picked up Starla from the table by the head and effortlessly showed her off like some prize fish. "This stupid bitch needed to be put in her place for breaking the rules," he shouted, before slamming Starla back onto the table. "Then shouldn't your anger be turned on that brat? He's the one that followed her advice," Matthew shouted back, slamming his cane onto the floor and pointing an accusatory finger at Garibaldi. "You aren't above harming children, so why does he get special treatment?" he demanded to know, which caused me to grip my chest as it began to beat uncontrollably. My suspicion was being proven more and more right. I had made a horrible mistake in joining the Freakshow. "Don't you dare question me. You're on thin ice," Garibaldi hissed, as a loud cracking noise began to emanate from him. I covered my mouth with my hand as I watched his scar split open again and teeth emerge from inside the hole in his face. "You're only here because I enjoy your act. And keep this up, and I'll happily get rid of the both of you," Garibaldi hissed, his voice becoming more distorted and more chirping began coming out from his mouth. I could tell that Matthew was starting to regret what he had said, as he started backing up from Garibaldi. I stared at Garibaldi as more changes to his body began happening before my eyes. Large, pincer-like mandibles sprouted from his mouth and began snapping together as he started closing the distance between himself and Matthew. His neck began to stretch out with loud bone cracking and snapping. I clutched my chest tightly, as it felt like my heart would explode at any second. My suspicion was quickly becoming true before my very eyes. Garibaldi was the giant mantis that I'd seen eating that person inside his office. To prove this point further, large, colorful wings sprouted out from his back along with 2 insect legs from his abdomen. And to finish it off, even a pair of antennas sprouted from his head and began twitching around. Matthew was in as much horror as I was. His whole body was shaken, and even through his mask, I could detect just how scared he was. But what he did next surprised me more than anything. Instead of running away, he raised his cane and brought it down on Garibaldi's head. With a loud crack, I thought for sure he'd split Garibaldi's head wide open like a watermelon. But that crack was Matthew's cane splitting in half. Before Matthew could fully react to what had happened, Garibaldi had sliced his face with his now long and clawed fingers, knocking Matthew's mask off into pieces and sending him to the ground. My eyes widened when I got to see what Matthew looked like underneath his blue and white mask. While the right side of his face was completely normal, his left side was petrified stone and gnarled into a horrible snarl that reminded me of a gargoyle. "Oh, you're gonna wish you never did that," Garibaldi's distorted and horrific voice screamed at Matthew as he raised his arms to bring down another swipe to the Frenchman that would have probably torn him to shreds, if not for the phone that started ringing on the table. Garibaldi wiggled his antennas and stared back at the table before letting out a low screech and racing towards it. "What?" he screamed at the phone.
"Is this a bad time?"
The same soothing southern voice asked from earlier. I was confused as to how he'd answered the phone, but upon closer inspection, I saw that Starla had pushed the speaker button from her position on the table. She really was okay despite being torn in half. The voice seemingly brought Garibaldi back to reality, as his horrible transformation was seemingly undone faster than it had taken him to begin it. He was quickly back to normal, and even seemed in better spirits than before as he seemed excited to talk to the person on the other end. "Oh, no, of course not, Creole. I was just disciplining one of my members," he said, as he looked back at Matthew, who quickly gathered his broken mask and cane and made his exit as quickly as he could.
"See, I don't have that problem. Puppets are much easier to deal with."
Creole chuckled from the other end, and Garibaldi joined him. It was at this point that I threw out the idea of apologizing to Garibaldi and ran as fast as I could away from the tent. Once inside, I fell to my knees and threw up what little oatmeal I had eaten from my breakfast. I struggled to control my breathing, and in a blind panic, I stood up and started running towards where I had seen Santiago and Nikolai. I found the two of them talking outside the big top, and before either could greet me, I ran into Santiago full force and began trying to tell him everything that I had seen, but it was lost in a confusing mess of my crying, hyperventilating, and sniffles. Nikolai left to go get Abigail while Santiago did his best to calm me down on his own, wrapping his arms around me and giving me a soft squeeze as he let me cry into him. When Abigail arrived and also helped me try and calm down, I began to tell them everything I had seen and been through. The giant mantis, Garibaldi's transformation, Starla, Izard's prophecy, and Matthew's face. And to my surprise, none of them seemed shocked by it at all. They all instead looked saddened, and Abigail took the lead by putting her hand on my shoulder and sighing. "We're sorry you found out so soon," she told me, which sent shock waves through my whole body. You all knew?" I asked them, feeling a sense of betrayal that they'd so readily accepted me, without ever once telling me that the ringmaster of our freak show was in fact a human-eating mantis monster. And needless to say, I felt at the time that they'd allowed this to happen to me. "You have to understand, Benny, we didn't want anything to happen to you, so we thought that keeping you in the dark about him might have been better for you," she sighed, as she looked over at Nikolai and Santiago to back her up. Both of them nodded in agreement. "Did you talk to Tony about anything else?" she asked, trying to see if there was anything else that bothered me. "Well, we talked about his wife and her accident," I told them, which caused Abigail to let go of my shoulder and stare at me like I'd said the most offensive thing I could have said to her. I was confused by this, and Nikolai sighed as he rubbed his hair with his heavily scarred arm. "It wasn't an accident. He turned into a mantis and killed Renator one night," Nikolai explained, avoiding my gaze and staring down at the grass behind us. I felt my heart drop to the center of the earth upon hearing that. Hearing how Garibaldi had spoken about Lucille and how much he loved her, and now hearing that he'd been the reason she was dead sent a horrible feeling up my spine. If he could do that to someone he loved and cared about, what could he do to me? I don't want to be here anymore," I told them, in a tone barely above a whisper. Abigail was again shocked by my words, but I noticed that Santiago wasn't. He was playing with his long sleeves and looking down at the floor, before he looked at me and let out a sigh. "Neither do I," he told me. How can you both say that? We're a family here. We love and care for each other. You can't just decide that you don't want to be here anymore," Abigail said, keeping her voice down, but was clearly upset over our statements. It didn't surprise me much, since she loved everyone in the freak show. She was like our mom and obviously didn't want us to leave.
Abby, I'm not happy here anymore,
Santiago told her, looking over at her and removing the clown hat from his head.
It started off being so much fun, but Tony isn't the same person anymore. He's getting a lot worse, and I'm afraid something's going to happen to all of us if this keeps up. I mean, how many more times can he repair Starla before she isn't even a real person anymore?
He asked her, which clearly struck a chord with Abigail. I don't care either way, Nikolai shrugged, producing a butterfly knife from seemingly nowhere and started to play around with it. I'd noticed he usually only did this if he was deep in thought and needed something to fidget with. But Santi is right. He's been getting a lot worse, especially since he started going to those meetings with those other freaks. Nikolai sighed as he continued doing tricks with his butterfly knife.
I'm not having this conversation,
Abigail said, turning her back on us and walking away quickly. It hurt me to see her in such denial, but I'd seen it before in my mom whenever she made excuses for my dad. It was a little bit more than déjà vu.
What other freaks?
I asked Nikolai. He looked down at me as I stood up from my spot on the ground.
What freaks has he seen?
That freak Creole is one of them. I don't know the others, but ever since he started hanging out with them, he's been getting a lot more unhinged. So if you two are serious about leaving this place, I'd say it'd be best to leave when he goes to one of those meetings, Nikolai told us, as he continued playing around with his knife.
What do you think?
I turned to ask Santiago. The normally happy and jovial clown looked like he'd suddenly aged several years. He looked at me and nodded.
I'll go with you. You're going to need an adult to look after you,
he said with a smile, lifting an arm to tussle my hair, which got a smile from me.
By the way, where's your shapeshifter friend? He usually sticks to you like glue.
He laughed a little at his lame joke. I looked down at my neck, expecting to see my shapeshifter friend still coiled around my throat. But he wasn't there. Looking around for him, I was confused as to where he could be. Turning around, I suddenly was alerted to someone standing behind me.
Hello, you three,
Garibaldi said with a hollow inflection.
Am I interrupting?
He asked, staring up at us with a fake smile. His colorful eyes were narrowed and revealed that he was angry with us. And to my shock and horror, I saw that my shapeshifter friend was perched on his shoulder now.
I heard you were thinking about leaving the Freakshow,
he asked, as his scar once again split open and teeth emerged from inside. The three of us stared at Garibaldi in horror as he continued transforming in front of us. I got a horrible feeling that this was where I was going to end up dying. But instead of immediately attacking us in a frenzy, Garibaldi grabbed me and Santiago by the arms and pulled us close to him as the small mantis legs burst from his abdomen.
We're gonna talk in my office, you two.
His voice was distorted and a bit hard to understand, and Nikolai tried to say something, but before he could, Garibaldi snapped his head to look at him and let out a few chirps, which sufficiently shut him up as he dragged me and Santiago away towards his office. Despite the fact that we both struggled against his pulling of us, he easily dragged us aboard the train and towards his office car. When we arrived, he shoved us into the office and entered behind us, closing the door and putting himself between us and it.
Oh, you two think you can just up and leave?
He screamed at us, as his horrifying transformation continued. His hands began to stretch out along with his neck, as it looked like he was being stretched out like a piece of bubblegum. The mantis legs in his abdomen also grew larger along with him as he started moving closer to us. "You can't just leave this family. I gave you everything you could ever want, and now you're just gonna up and leave?" He screeched and chirped as the scar on his face opened up completely and replaced his original mouth with a maw of sharp teeth. His hands completely morphed into mantis claws, and any semblance of humanity began to disappear from him. With his transformation nearly complete, he began approaching me, and any ability he had to speak English completely removed and replaced with clicking and chirping. "Benny," Santiago spoke to me softly. I looked over at him and expected him to start saying goodbye to me, but instead, I watched as he grabbed one of the heavy mantis statues from Garibaldi's desk. "Run!" he shouted at me as he threw the statue as hard as he could at the giant mantis. It landed with a loud thud against his head and got a loud screech from him. The last few traces of humanity slipped away from Garibaldi as he was completely transformed into a giant mantis. Santiago pushed me out of the way as Garibaldi jumped at the two of us, his giant wings flapping as he landed on his desk and slashed down at the two of us with his claws. I landed on the floor with a thud and quickly looked up to see if Santiago had made it. With his pigeon toes, I was afraid that he wouldn't be able to move away from Garibaldi's attacks, but to my surprise, I watched as the clown effortlessly backflipped away from the mantis. "Benny, get out of here, quickly!" he shouted at me as he picked up a chair from the floor and threw it at Garibaldi. That was the last straw for him as he quickly turned his attention towards Santiago and jumped at him, slashing downward at the clown as he effortlessly began backflipping away from the bug's attacks. Acting quickly, I ran to the door and tried to turn the knob, only to find it locked from the other side somehow. I was trapped in there. "It's locked," I shouted at him, turning just in time to dodge a flying couch that crashed into the wall next to me. Santiago stared over at me with worry before again dodging a swing from Garibaldi, who was getting frustrated at the clown for his effortless dodging. Santiago quickly grabbed a broken chair leg from the floor and held it in his hand, pulling down his long sleeves to be able to get a better grip on it. When Garibaldi lunged at him, the clown swung the chair leg as hard as he could at the mantis. A sickening thwack echoed across the room as Garibaldi's mantis head split open and blood began pouring from his wound. He staggered around before falling to the floor with a thud. Santiago quickly followed this up with several more bashes to the head. After he had given Garibaldi a few more hard whacks, he dropped the chair leg and panted softly. Quickly, he started to waddle over to me and began to check on me like I had just been in some horrible accident. With all that he had just done, I should have been the one checking up on him. "Are you okay?" he finally asked me after manually inspecting me. I nodded at him and quickly pointed at the door. "Santi, Benny, are you two okay?" Nikolai asked from the other side of the door as he banged on it. The two of us quickly looked over at the door and quickly sat up to go and meet the Russian. Santiago grabbed the doorknob and twisted it and confirmed what I had told him about the door being locked. "Nicky, the door's locked on our side. Can you get it?" Before Santiago could finish, Garibaldi's claw pierced through his stomach. I turned slowly to look at him. He looked down at the claw in horror as Garibaldi lifted him off the floor and up towards his mouth. I let out a pained scream at seeing the best friend I'd made at the Freakshow hurt, and most likely fatally so. The door broke off its hinges as Nikolai burst in after using his metal leg to bust it down. And he, too, stared in horror as his friend was impaled by the mantis. Before Garibaldi could do anything else to Santiago, though, he suddenly staggered on his four legs. The damage that Santiago had given him had not been for nothing. He let Santiago fall from his claw and staggered back from us as he grabbed his bleeding head with his claws. Santiago landed on the floor with a loud crack and a pained wheeze, like his ribs had been broken along with a gaping hole in his gut. Nikolai quickly ran to him and dropped to his knees, clutching him in his arms, and tried to stop the bleeding with his hands. Santiago turned to me, and I watched him reach an arm out towards me.
Run, he croaked out as his arm dropped to the floor and he let out a pain-croak-filled breath. Nikolai stared down at him and began clutching his limp body in his arms. He gave Santiago one last hug before he set his limp body down on the floor. He pulled out a long Bowie knife from his back pocket and stood up. "Get out of here, kid," he told me, as he started to approach Garibaldi before running full sprint towards the disoriented mantis. Just as he was about to plunge his knife into the mantis, though, Garibaldi smacked him away with his claws and sent the Russian crashing into the wall into a pile of destroyed furniture. Before I could stand up to run, the mantis jumped over to me and landed on top of me, pinning me to the floor and screeching at me as he leaned down, his mandibles opening and closing as drool and blood dripped down from his head onto me. I lifted my arms to my face to shield myself from the horrible death I was about to receive before I suddenly found myself able to move. Nikolai had recovered and managed to climb onto Garibaldi like a horse. He plunged his giant knife into the mantis's neck. Garibaldi let out a gurgled and pained screech as more blood began to pour out of his wound. Nikolai pulled out the knife and was about to plunge it back in when Garibaldi dropped to the floor and rolled around. Nikolai was knocked from him, and I stared in horror as Garibaldi grabbed him with both claws and brought him up to his head. Nikolai shouted and screamed in Russian just before Garibaldi brought his head into his mouth and began to tear it from him. Nikolai screamed as his head was being removed from his body. His voice distorted as his tendons and bones snapped and his head was completely removed from his shoulders. Garibaldi didn't even bother eating Nikolai, instead just letting his lifeless body and his head fall to the floor. Finally, I stood up and began running out of the office. I was crying uncontrollably and just wanted to get out of there any way that I could. So I ran out into the train corridor and started running towards the door when I ran into someone at full speed and knocked the both of us to the floor. "What the hell?" Matthew was about to ask. I looked up at him and noticed that his destroyed mask was barely held together by a few pieces of duct tape. He looked down at me and then over towards Garibaldi's office. The mantis was crawling on all his appendages out of the office and towards us, and I thought for sure that Matthew was about to feed me to Garibaldi when I felt him clutch me close to him. "Hang on, kid," he said, as he quickly searched his pocket and pulled out a deck of cards. Just as Garibaldi began lunging towards us, Matthew bent his deck of cards and allowed them all to fly out of his hand and cover us. Then suddenly, we were in a different train car. I looked around in terror and panting uncontrollably and about to have a complete meltdown when 4 familiar masked faces all looked down at me and Matthew. I was with the aces in their train car. Seeing my obvious distress, they all quickly crowded around me and Matthew. "Ugh, that was close," the Frenchman sighed as he let me go and used his cane to stand up. The aces quickly replaced him as they all quickly crowded around me and gave me hugs and pats on the head. "You'll be safe here. My magic is hopefully enough to keep him at bay, and the aces can double as bodyguards," he told me as he sat down on the mattress that all the aces shared together. I have to get out of here," I whimpered to him, and tears still streaming down my face as I quickly stood up and tried to make it to the door, but Matthew blocked my path. I tried in vain to get past him. My hand was grabbed from behind, and I quickly turned to see Spade staring up at me and vigorously shaking his head. "Oh, that isn't a good idea right now," Matthew told me. "The way he is right now, he might just kill all of us." The illusionist leaned his head back and softly banged it against the train wall. "I'll have to call his voodoo friend. He's the only person who can possibly calm him down when he gets like that," he said, grunting as he stood up. Do you know how to reach him?" I asked him, as clubs and spades softly patted my head. I could feel like I was about to have a total breakdown, but I didn't want to do that in front of Matthew. I just wanted to be alone, or at least alone with the aces. "I have his number for Starla-related emergencies," he sighed,
walking over to the door. I'm gonna go call him, and hopefully he can stop him before he rampages. Stay here with the aces and try to get some sleep. Judging by the look in your eyes, you saw something really bad," he said, before opening the door and leaving me alone with the aces. Finally left alone with the aces, I stood up and walked over to their bed. Climbing on top of it, and quickly being followed by them, I curled up into a ball and began to cry uncontrollably for the loss of my 2 friends. The aces quickly all huddled around me and formed a protective layer around me as I cried uncontrollably and deeply into my hands. I must have fallen asleep there with the aces because the next thing I remember, I was waking up in a cold sweat with a surprised gasp. And clutching my chest, I looked around and desperately hoped that what had happened had been a dream. Some horrible nightmare. It was a nightmare, all right, but it wasn't a dream in any sense. I was in the bed with the aces, and Matthew was sitting on a train bench next to the bed. "You're still alive," he told me, rolling his cane around in his hands and staring at the floor. I looked down and saw that the aces were still asleep, and that all of them were still crowded around me. I sighed and rubbed the dried-up tears off from my eyes. "Breakfast is about to be served. You need to eat something," Matthew said, as he stopped fiddling with his cane and used it to push himself up to his feet. I don't want to," I told him. All I wanted was to curl up in this bed and never leave. I had a horrible feeling that Nikolai and Santiago had died because of me. I was pulled out of that destructive line of thought by Matthew putting his hand on my head. "I know you don't want to, but you have to. Otherwise, you'll never be able to live it down," he explained to me, and offered me his hand. I took a shaky breath and grabbed it. I squeezed it, and he nodded as he helped me out of the bed, the aces barely moving at all. "Don't worry about them. They don't need to eat," he told me, as he held my hand, and we started to make our way towards a table where we all ate together. Everyone was there except for Garibaldi, and of course, my 2 dead friends. Even Starla was there, all fixed up, and staring down at the meal that had been placed in front of her. I let go of Matthew's hand and took my spot at the table, staring down at the pancakes in front of me and trying my best to try and eat at least a nibble of it. "Where are those 2? Eva asked suddenly, tisking in annoyance as she yanked on Jasper's hair as she held him tied into a ponytail. He winced in pain and nudged her back with an elbow to her side for doing so. "Hey, street trash, you're their best friend. Where the hell are they?" she asked me, after she had gotten done tying Jasper's ponytail. I stared down at my pancakes and just let my fork fall onto the plate. I couldn't do anything except start crying my eyes out again. I think that was enough to clue everyone in at the table what had happened to Nikolai and Santiago. The mood quickly dampened with that, and it got worse when Garibaldi arrived at the table. Looking up from my pancakes, I saw that Santiago and Nikolai had done a number on him in their final moments. His face and neck were bandaged and bruised badly, with the blood quickly seeping into the bandages. Every breath he took was followed by a whistling wheeze of air escaping the stab wound in his neck. He took a seat across from me, and I could feel those multicolored eyes of his staring deep into my soul. I stared at my pancake for a few more minutes, just not moving, while everyone around me ate their food in silence. Finally, I pushed my chair away from the table and silently started making my way towards my room. Garibaldi was about to say something to me, and probably yell at me for leaving the table unexcused, but his voice was barely above a whisper, and it was followed by a violent coughing fit. I didn't bother to turn around and look at him, electing instead to just go to my room. Once there, I quickly shut the door and locked it behind me. Sitting down on my bed, I looked over at my desk, almost expecting my shapeshifter to be there. But then I remembered him being on Garibaldi's shoulder. He'd disappeared after I had run away from Tony's office, and when Santiago and I had started talking about leaving. He hadn't been my friend at all. He'd been a spy. How else had Garibaldi learned about why I'd run away from home? I tightly curled up my fists and felt like smashing them against any surface I could. But instead, I closed my eyes and let out a long breath after counting down from 10. Anger wasn't going to get me anywhere, so I decided to make a place. I walked over to the art station that Garibaldi had provided for me in this room and quickly began to work on a way that I could escape the Freakshow. Grabbing construction paper and crayons, I began drawing out the layout for the Freakshow. The big top, the train, our living quarters, the tents outside for the twins, Zara and mac and cheese. I also drew out myself, along with a monster Garibaldi and the traitor shapeshifter. Thinking it over, I started trying to work out ways to escape. Being that we were still in France, it'd be a gamble if I could even survive in a foreign country without knowing the language or having money. But anything was better than being a prisoner here. I thought about just avoiding Garibaldi until we had to board the train. Then either book it before we boarded, or jump off the train once we got going. Both had massive flaws, of course. One was that it was unlikely that Garibaldi would allow me to go that long without coming into contact with him, and the fact I still had no idea how the train worked. I mean, it didn't require tracks to move, and somehow we'd gone from the US to France in a train. Those ideas were scrapped as I tried to think of a few more scenarios. A quick thought was put towards maybe enlisting members of the Freakshow to aid in my escape, but after losing Santiago and Nikolai, I refused to put anyone else's life in danger. None of my ideas seemed to be working out. And just as my frustration grew, I heard a soft knock at my door. "Benny, dear?" Abigail's soft and sad voice came from the hallway. She was the last person I wanted to talk to at this moment, except maybe Garibaldi, of course. Despite not wanting to see her, I stood up and walked over to the door and unlocked it, before walking back over to my desk and starting to think of another way to escape. Abigail walked into my room, and I heard her set down a plate of what I assumed was food she wanted me to eat. But I had no intention of eating anything, and I just continued scribbling off ideas that could possibly get me to safety and away from the Freakshow. "Sweetheart, please don't leave," she begged of me, walking over to me, but remaining a good distance away. "I can't bear to see you leave too. Santi and Nikki are gone, and I can't bear the thought of losing you too," she said through tears of her own. I clutched the crayon I was using in my fist and winced when it snapped in half. This simple act of inflicting accidental pain on it caused me to start crying as well. But I did my best to keep it silent. "Every person in this circus is like a child to me, Benny, and I can't bear to lose another person, especially you. Please don't leave us," she begged, and reached out to touch me. I quickly grabbed all the materials I'd been using and walked past her with my head kept down. Walking as quickly as I could and out of my room despite Abigail's pleas to remain, I had to leave her there, because if I didn't, I knew that I'd most likely agree to stay. I elected to try and plan in Santiago's room. The fact he wouldn't be there to greet me would hopefully be enough to get me to focus on my escape attempt. Before I reached his room, however, I ran into Zara. She stared down at me with her single eye, and I was about to walk wordlessly past her when she lowered her hand down to me and revealed she was holding another emerald necklace. I reached to my neck to check on the previous one that I was wearing and discovered that the jewel had been broken. "A new charm you require," she said to me. I nodded and took it from her. I looked up at her and saw that she had the same pained expression I imagined that I had as well. "The mantis revealed itself to you, and now you wish to escape its claws." She got down on her knees and reached her hands out to hold my face in them. She wiped my tears away from my eyes with her thumbs.
"Can you help me?"
I asked her, clutching the good luck charm she had given me into my chest. She looked into my eyes and nodded. She quickly looked around to make sure no one was around before bringing me in close to whisper into my ear.
"A moonless night it shall be. The mantis does not sleep much. His spy will surely be on the hunt, but by sneaking through the giant flower's petals, you may have a chance,"
she told me, before letting go of my face and standing up to her feet. Tussling my hair, she quickly left down the hallway and left me to think over what she'd just told me. It would be a new moon tonight. Garibaldi doesn't sleep much, and the shapeshifter will be spying on me. But if I was able to sneak out from the big top, I'd stand a chance. Armed with this knowledge, I nodded and quickly started to make my way toward Santiago's room, fully prepared to work on a plan that would save me from falling into the mantis's claws again. Finally arriving in Santiago's room, I was surprised it wasn't filled with clown items like balloons or streamers. It was pretty plain and only really had personal photos to decorate with. But he had plenty of photos, as he covered an entire section of his wall. It was him with every member of the circus, from Nikolai and Abby to even members I'd never seen before. Members I assumed had met the same fate that he and Nikolai had faced. Gripping the materials I'd brought close to my chest, I quickly laid them across the floor and began setting up the plan I had hatched. Taking Zara's advice into my plan, I had to find a way both to ensure that Garibaldi fell asleep and that I could get past the shapeshifter. Setting out my map and props, I tried to think of a few ways I could ensure that I could escape. The idea of fighting Antonio one-on-one wasn't viable after what I had seen him do to Santiago and Nikolai, so I had to think of a plan that played to my strengths. The most important thing was to make sure that Garibaldi fell asleep. The fact that tonight would be a new moon probably ensured that he would be on high alert. As I pondered on some ideas, I was interrupted by knocking. I held my breath as several more knocks quickly followed the first one. I was worried what lay behind the door, but the French accent on the other side quickly dispelled some of the fear I had growing inside of me. "You'd better open the door before they bash it down," Matthew said. I quickly shot up to my feet and opened the door, and was quickly tackled to the ground by the aces. They all hugged me and clung to me. They had been worried for me after I had left breakfast in such a bad mood. "Seems like you've been busy." The Frenchman walked past me and the aces and over to the crude map I'd laid out on the floor. I finally got the aces off of me and quickly closed the door so we wouldn't have any unwanted eyes on us. "I'm planning on leaving tonight. It's a new moon and it's going to be my best chance," I told him, as the aces followed me over to the map. All of them looked down at it inquisitively and moved the little monster Garibaldi model I had made around the map. I smiled a little at them and was glad that they could calm me down as much as they did. "That's probably for the best," Matthew said, as he sat down on Santiago's bed and tapped his cane on the floor. "I take it by the look on your face, you snagged on something," he asked me, his voice muffled behind his barely held together mask. I nodded and sighed as I knelt and took the Garibaldi model out of Club's hands. "I can't figure out how to make sure he falls asleep tonight. Zara told me that he barely sleeps, and I figured tonight he isn't going to sleep at all," I explained to Matthew. He nodded and tapped his fingers on his cane in thought. "I've got something that could help," he sighed and stood up from the bed with a pained grunt. He'd reached a gloved hand into his pocket and pulled out a prescription bottle. He tossed them over to me and I caught them in surprise. "My sleeping pills. I'm in pain constantly because of my condition, so those help me sleep at night. Find a way to get him to take those, and they should knock him out cold."
I nodded and looked down at the bottle filled with pills. If I could somehow get Garibaldi to eat them, the best way was to somehow get him into his food. Of course, that was going to be difficult, but I at least had a way to ensure he fell asleep tonight. "Thank you," I told Matthew, to which he brushed it off and started heading towards the door to leave. As he reached the knob, he stopped and turned back to look at me. "It's best for you if you run as far away as possible from here, and don't look back. If you dwell on it, it'll be as if you never escaped." With those words of advice, he opened the door and left me alone with the aces. I looked down at them all because they were staring up at me. I figured that they'd guessed that I was running away, and they were divided on how they should be feeling. I'm sorry, you guys. I have to leave," I told them, and all of them looked down at the floor in obvious sadness, all except Spades. He approached me and pulled down his long sleeve. I stared at the skeletal hand that stared back at me. It was bleached white and almost looked like a fake skeleton that they use in classrooms. But despite that, I didn't take too much notice of it. Instead, I looked at the bag of marbles sitting in the skeletal hand. "For me?" I asked Spades hesitantly. He nodded and extended his skeletal arm out further for me to take them. I reached out and took the bag. Opening them up, I took a peek inside and saw that each marble had an ace symbol on them. I smiled and could feel tears welling up in my eyes as I closed the bag and reached out for a hug from them. They all quickly pounced on me and shoved themselves onto me. I gave them all a tight hug and finally realized why all of them had felt so lightweight and thin. They were literal skeletons under their costumes. But that didn't matter to me anymore. They waved goodbye to me, and as one final trick, they all held hands and formed a wheel to roll out of Santiago's room. I couldn't help but giggle at them and wave goodbye. Now, with the means to ensure that Garibaldi would fall asleep, I had to tackle the problem of the shapeshifter. Knowing his power and what he was capable of, he was the next biggest obstacle to my escape. I somehow had to get him separated from Garibaldi and away from him. I figured that, while I was thinking about how to get the traitor out of the way, I decided to make my way to the kitchen to spike Garibaldi's food with Matthew's sleeping pills. Slipping out of Santiago's room, I quickly closed the door behind me and started making my way down the halls. Before I got very far, though, I was quickly grabbed from behind and yanked into one of the spare rooms. I was about to bite down on whoever was grabbing me, but they suddenly let go. Spinning around to see who it was, I was relieved to see that it was Starla. "You're all better now," I said thankfully, quickly wrapping my arms around her in a hug, though being careful not to break her in half. She nodded and reached over the table near us and handed me a glass jar with the lid screwed onto it. I stared at it and then looked back up at her. "What am I supposed to do with this?" She pointed at the floor behind me. I looked at her and then followed where she was pointing. It took me a while to figure out what she was even pointing at, since at first I figured that there was nothing there. Then I noticed that she was pointing at my shadow, and that's when I figured out that she was giving me the jar to trap the shapeshifter in. "Can you not talk anymore?" I asked her. She stared back at me from behind her mask and softly shook her head. I clenched my hands around the jar so much that I thought I was going to break it. It seemed like since I had joined the Freakshow, I had only succeeded in getting other people hurt. Ezekiel, Santiago, Nikolai, and Starla. It all felt like it was my fault. Before I continued down that line of thinking, though, Starla wrapped her arms around me and pulled me into a hug. Although she couldn't speak,
It made me feel like it was her way of telling me that it wasn't my fault, that it was up to me to get out of here. I shoved my face into her differently colored torso and worded a teary apology to her. She left the room first so we wouldn't be seen leaving together. Garibaldi was probably already suspicious of her after she had told me to go into his office, so it was a good idea. I waited a few minutes before leaving with the jar and heading towards the big top. From there, I quickly moved past Eva and Jasper as they practiced a new routine. They were so busy arguing with each other that they paid me no mind as I went into the room that led to the kitchen. I'd never been back in the kitchen, so I didn't exactly know what to expect. It looked like any giant kitchen might look. Sort of like a diner's kitchen, just equipped with more items than an espresso maker and a deep fryer and other appliances. I had to figure out what we were even eating tonight, and which plate would be Garibaldi's. As I started wandering around, I heard someone approaching from the big top and instantly started panicking. Thinking quickly, I opened up one of the ovens and crawled my way in. Just as I did so, I nearly let out a surprised shout as I saw something moving inside of the oven. It was that burnt piece of toast with human eyeballs inside of it. The eyes were looking in all directions, and before I could even figure out which eye to look at, it quickly hissed at me and scurried out of the oven. I left the door open, just enough to hear what was happening. Oh, if he tries to leave again, I won't go easy on him. That's final. Garibaldi's hoarse voice entered the kitchen once the door finally swung open. His voice, which was scratchy already beforehand, was like nails on a chalkboard now, after the injuries to the neck he had taken during his fight with Nikolai. Antonio, please, he's only a child. I heard Abigail's pleading voice follow him into the kitchen. I took a peek from inside the oven and watched as she followed him. Her makeup was ruined by tears, and it made me feel terrible for having hurt her feelings so badly. Oh, he knew the rules, Garibaldi shouted, smashing his hand onto the table next to him and sending silverware flying everywhere. No one leaves the Freakshow, and that's final, he screamed at her, sending him into a dry coughing fit into his hand. As he did this, he chirped a few times and clutched his chest as he tried to gain composure over himself. I understand, Abigail said in defeat, after a few minutes of silence broken only by Garibaldi's wheezing breath and coughs. I'll start working on your dinner, sir, she told him with a sigh. He didn't say anything for a moment before turning to leave. I waited till I heard his steps leave the kitchen before emerging from the oven. Now do you get why I have to leave? I asked her. She was startled by me and nearly dropped the bowl of flour that she had picked up from underneath the kitchen table. She stared at me and then over towards the kitchen doors, almost like she was expecting him to come running in now that I had suddenly appeared. Benny, please don't leave. She tried to convince me again, but I could tell her heart wasn't in it anymore. I think in that moment of Garibaldi's anger and my desire to leave, it finally broke through to her that I had to. What are you even doing in here? She asked me, after taking a few moments to wipe the tears from her eyes. I was hoping to drug his food or something so that he goes to sleep, I told her, and reached into my pocket to show her the bottle of sleeping pills. She looked at me with surprise and was probably wondering where I'd even gotten the drugs in the first place. But she looked over at the items before her and then back at me. Putting them in his food won't work, but maybe in his wine, she told me, as she reached out for the pills. I hesitated in giving her them, as I still didn't know if she was truly trying to help me escape. But that sad look in her eye told me that she did want me to leave. So I handed her the bottle and watched as she walked over to a nearby wine rack and picked out one of the bottles.
I'll pour him a glass laced with pills and then also spike the bottle for when he gets a refill. If the first glass doesn't work, then hopefully the next ones will do it." She sat the bottle of wine next to her ingredients and sighed. It looked like it was physically painful for her to be doing this. Given how much she loved and cared for us all, it was hurting her. I fully climbed out of the oven and wrapped my arms around her and buried my face into her plush body. "I wish you could have been my real mom," I told her as I clutched her tightly. It was the truth. I truly did wish she could have been my real mother. That started the tears again for both of us as she fell to the floor with me, and we hugged and cried into each other for a few minutes. "Go before I change my mind and beg you to stay," she said, after she finally pulled herself away from me. I nodded and quickly picked up the jar from the oven and exited the kitchen. I stopped only one last time to look at her and wave goodbye. She did the same to me, and I exited the kitchen. The last obstacle that needed removing was the shapeshifter. As I walked back towards Santiago's room, I entered and closed the door behind me. While I thought about how to trap him, I looked again at all the photos that Santiago had on his wall, and one of them caught my eye. I plucked it from the wall and looked down at it. It was one of Nikolai and Santiago looking at each other, with nothing but fun and enjoyment. "I'm sorry, you guys," I told the picture, as if they could hear me from behind the photo. Taking the photo with me, I looked around Santiago's room some more and found one of the hats that Santiago wore. Along with that, I found a couple of knives in his wardrobe, which no doubt had come from Nikolai. There was one last thing I had to do before I could escape. Taking the items, I again left Santiago's room, this time for the last time. Sneaking out into the open air, I walked some distance from the tents and knelt in the grass. Taking out one of Nikolai's knives, I plunged it into the dirt and put Santiago's hat on top of it. I gathered a few rocks and used them to prop up the photo of the two against the knife. I didn't know what Garibaldi had done to their bodies, but I doubt that he'd give them a proper burial. So I decided to do it myself. "You guys made me feel like I belonged here, and when I needed you guys most, you were there," I whimpered, as tears started falling from my eyes again. "I'll miss you guys so much," I told them, and kissed my finger and tapped the picture of the two of them. With my final goodbye to them said, I headed back into the tent and straight to my room. I started packing a few things, though I didn't exactly have anything to take with me from my arrival. I packed some paper and pencils and a couple of snacks in the bag of marbles the aces had given me. I looked over at my desk and noticed a book had been left there. I walked over to it and saw that it was an English to French dictionary with a note attached to it. For the boy who defies fate. It was signed by Zara. It seemed that everyone in the Freakshow wanted me to escape, and I was sure that I would get away from here with all of their help. As I tucked the book into my bag, an idea suddenly popped into my head. I grabbed the jar and looked over to the door to my room. If I didn't attend dinner, Garibaldi would have to send someone to come and fetch me. And if he suspected anybody of trying to help me, he could only send one thing to come and get me. I finished packing and quickly hunkered with the jar next to the door and waited. I could hear people walking around outside when dinner time finally arrived, but I didn't move an inch from my position and continued to stare at the gap in the door from the floor. I don't think I've ever waited so patiently for something like that in my life, and I sometimes wonder if I fell asleep somewhere in the middle of it. But suddenly, I heard footsteps that didn't seem to belong to a person, they sounded more like the pitter-patter of a dog. The shapeshifter arrived at my door and stopped in front of it. He took a few moments to sniff at my door, and even tried clawing at it after a while. I held my breath as I slowly opened the jar and held it out in front of me for the right moment. That moment soon came when I heard the unmistakable sound of him transforming into something. Suddenly, a spider emerged from under the door, and I swooped in to quickly shove it into the jar. As quickly as I could, I slammed the lid on top of it and spun it shut. "I got you," I said, with glee and a big heap of malice in my voice. This thing had pretended to be my friend this whole time, and all the while, it had spied on me and relayed that information back to Garibaldi. And now I had him captured. The shapeshifter stared at me with all his spider eyes for a moment before he dissolved into a puddle and suddenly started growing larger. It was there that it occurred to me that he could simply grow into something bigger and just break out of the jar. I began to panic as he grew more and began to shake it, and yet he didn't break through. In fact, he couldn't break through. He tried it several more times before he gave up and returned to his spider form. "It's magic," I marveled at the jar. Try as he might, he couldn't break out of it, and with his capture, my escape plan was finally set and prepared. I walked over to my bed and sat with the jar in my hands. I wanted to say so many things to the shapeshifter, and yet I decided saying nothing to him was better. I watched him try in vain to escape, and I'll give him props for stubbornness, because for several hours he bashed his head against the jar in whatever form he could think of. When night finally came, I still decided to wait. I didn't know how long the sleeping pills would take to affect Garibaldi, so I figured waiting some more would only help me in my endeavor. I had to find ways to stop myself from falling asleep, since several times throughout the night, I could feel myself drifting off. And needless to say, slapping yourself hard is a pretty good way of staying awake. I looked over at the clock on my wall and saw that it was 2:30 in the morning. It was now or never. I picked up the jar and stared down at the shapeshifter. He had exhausted himself and was lying down as a little black mouse with red eyes. I took a deep breath and sat him down on my bed. "Bye," was all I told him, as he frantically again tried to escape. I opened the door and exited my room for the last time. The tent was completely pitch black. So, for a minute, I stood in the hallway till my eyes adjusted to the dark. When I could finally see the outlines of things, I started making my way towards the big top. The entire Freakshow was quieter than a cemetery, and I felt like if I had made even the slightest bit of noise, it would alert everyone to my escape. So I tied my backpack close to me and kept walking forward as silently as I could. Every time I made even the slightest noise, I froze in place and waited to see if I could hear anything suddenly coming my way. And finally, I managed to make it to the big top. It felt like it had taken an hour, and I wouldn't have been surprised if it had been even longer. But I could just see the exit across the giant tent. Before I could make those steps towards freedom, though, I was suddenly blinded as every single light in the big top suddenly lit up. I shielded my eyes in pain as it felt like my eyeballs were going to melt right out of their sockets. When at last I felt like I could bear to lower my hands, I did, and I felt like I might throw up right there. "Buenos sera, Benny," Garibaldi's hoarse voice greeted me as I finally adjusted to the bright lights of the big top. A combination of electric and gas lamps were used to light up the entire tent, and after coming from the pitch black, it felt like being on the surface of the sun. "Cute trick you did there, slipping those pills into my wine," he chuckled, as I noticed that the bandages were removed from his face and he appeared to be completely healed. Only a nasty scar was left behind where Nikolai had stabbed him. "I guess it didn't work, huh?" I said, as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the other knife I had taken from Santiago's room and held it out in front of me like a sword. Garibaldi gave me a sad chuckle and started approaching me. I took a few steps back as he did, and he seemed crushed by that action.
"Oh, you want to leave too, don't you?" He sighed, removing his hat and running his fingers through his long white hair. "You know, when I told you how me and Lucille wanted to make a family, it was the truth. I truly did want a family with her, and when I couldn't, I did the next best thing. But every time, it seems like I just lose the people I love so much," he said with a pained sigh. It would have been almost believable if I hadn't seen him eat two of the people he considered a part of his family.
"Is that why you ate Lucille? Is that how you treat your family?"
I asked him, gripping the knife tightly and trying to act like it was some sort of protection against him. My words caught him off guard, as the pained look on his face suddenly turned into one of anger. "Oh, do you think I wanted to do that to her? She was the love of my life. I tried so hard to keep this curse from harming her, and yet I couldn't," he shouted at me, stomping his foot on the floor so hard he split open his facial scar and revealed the teeth hidden inside it. "You try controlling a curse like this and tell me how you like it," he chirped as he tried to get himself under control.
"I saw all those people in Santiago's picture wall. A lot of people I'd never seen here. You ate them too, didn't you?"
I asked him, staring at him as he was losing his temper at me.
"You never cared about any of us. You're nothing but a monster,"
I told him, which suddenly got me a slash across the cheek by his clawed hands. "Oh, you're right about one thing, Benny," Garibaldi chirped, as his humanity faded and the mantis began to take over. "I am a monster," he cackled as he lunged at me in full mantis form. I scurried away and onto the benches where the crowd usually sits. He hopped over me and was suddenly again in front of me swinging his claws. I quickly ducked and at last noticed I was bleeding from the claw slash he'd given me earlier. Remembering something Santiago had taught me, I quickly curled into a ball and rolled under him as he slashed again and just barely missed me. Underneath him, I tried stabbing up into his abdomen, but my little stab wasn't enough to pierce the exoskeleton, and he simply hopped away, fluttering his massive wings and buffeting me into some more benches. Now separated a bit from him, I quickly reached into my backpack for something that might help me. I didn't get much time, as the mantis jumped back over and took a few more swipes at me, which I managed to block with my backpack. The only thing I managed to grab was the bag of marbles, and it didn't seem like these could help me in any way. I tried at picking up some broken pieces of bench for another weapon besides the knife, but all of them were too heavy for me to lift. It felt increasingly like I wasn't going to make it out alive. As I was running away from him and he continued to swipe at me, I suddenly got an idea as I stared down at the bag of marbles in my hand. Using my knife, I quickly cut open the bag of marbles and allowed them to spill out onto the big top's floor. Garibaldi hadn't been expecting that, as he stepped over the mass of falling marbles and suddenly began to wobble and lose his balance. Before he could fully regain it, I stopped and turned around, running back at him and using my backpack as a sort of mini shield and slamming myself against the giant mantis. That sent him tumbling over and onto his back, and I watched with a smile as he thrashed and screeched around on the floor. He swiped and flung every appendage that he could to try and get himself back on his legs. As he thrashed around and screeched, he knocked into the main pole tent of the big top,
and knocked over a bunch of the kerosene lamps that hung from it. In a matter of seconds, they landed on the floor and broke open, unleashing a blazing inferno. I stared in horror and watched as Garibaldi continued to thrash uncontrollably and knocked into the main pole again, causing it to snap and break. With the tent on fire and collapsing, I turned around and started running. I dropped the knife and sprinted towards the Big Top's entrance. I reached it and took one last look back to see that Garibaldi was pinned beneath the Big Top's main tent pole as the entire structure began to catch fire around him. Satisfied that he couldn't follow after me, I ran off into the darkness of the French countryside and didn't once look back towards the burning inferno that the Freakshow had become. I ran until the sun at last started to rise. I collapsed on the side of the road and was taken to a French police station. With the help of the dictionary, I came up with some sort of excuse to tell them that I was from America and that I had been kidnapped, and before I knew it, I was back in the States. Instead of returning to my abusive father, I learned that my mother had worked up the courage to leave him. She was given sole custody of me, and I stayed with her and my grandparents. It's haunted me for years, not knowing if anyone survived that fire. Although my time in the Freakshow was short-lived, I cared deeply for every member, cherishing the memories I made with the first people who loved me. But as I got older, I'd forgotten all about the Freakshow. They seemed nothing more than a distant memory or a simple dream. That was until a few months ago, when I received an intricate red envelope in the mail. Inside it was a note that read, "Benny, or should I say Benjamin? Oh, it's so good to see that you managed to return to the U.S. I must say, long hair does suit you. Oh, I almost didn't recognize you at first when I laid eyes on you again. Glasses, facial hair, and even a smoker. Almost looks like you're trying to hide from me. Oh, I'm sure you've forgotten about me. But I'm sure this little trinket will jog your memory. See you soon." Signed, A.G. I stared at the letter and felt my hand shiver uncontrollably as I dug into the envelope further and pulled out a golden praying mantis lapel, the same one that Garibaldi wore on all of his suits. I allowed it to fall to the floor and looked around in terror. He'd survived.